I was 5 minutes away from signing over my $50 million logistics empire to my son when my daughter-in-law handed me a steaming cup of coffee with a smile that could cut glass. She thought she had won. She thought the old man was finally out of the way and that my fortune was as good as hers. But she didn't see the terror in the eyes of my loyal maid who bumped into me and whispered 2 words that saved my life. Don't drink. In that split second, I made a choice that would send one of us to the psych ward and the other on a warpath for justice. Before we get into how I destroyed them with a single signature, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe loyalty is worth more than blood. I am Douglas King, 72 years old, and I did not build King Logistics from a single rusty truck into a national powerhouse by being blind to human behavior. But sitting at the head of the mahogany conference table that morning, I had never felt more tired. The Chicago winter was howling against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, mirroring the coldness I felt in my bones. My son Brandon sat to my right, vibrating like a loose wire. He was 35 years old, but in that moment he looked like a nervous teenager waiting for the principal to expel him. He kept tapping his expensive pen against the leather folder containing the transfer of power documents. "Dad, are we ready to do this?" Brandon asked, his voice cracking slightly. "The board members are waiting downstairs for the announcement." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the climate-controlled room. I saw the way his eyes darted to the door every 10 seconds. For years, I had told myself that Brandon was just anxious, that he wanted to prove himself to me. But a man who has spent 2 years in the jungle in Vietnam knows the difference between eagerness and fear. Brandon wasn't eager to lead. He was desperate to escape something. I was just about to pick up my reading glasses when the heavy oak doors swung open. It was Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. Usually, Vanessa treated the headquarters of King Logistics like a contagious disease ward. She hated the smell of diesel, she hated the drivers, and she especially hated me. Yet there she was, wearing a designer dress that cost more than my first house, and carrying a silver tray with 2 mugs on it. "Good morning, Douglas," she chirped. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone I had never heard her use in the 3 years she had been married to my son. I thought we could use a little caffeine boost before the big signing, a toast to the new era. My internal radar started screaming. This woman had once told me to my face that I smelled like old money and cheap cigars. Now she was playing the dutiful daughter. She placed a blue ceramic mug in front of me and kept a red one for herself. "Hazelnut roast just how you like it," she said, smiling so wide I could see her gums. Brandon stopped tapping his pen. He looked at the cup, then at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. It was as if the entire room had sucked in a breath and was holding it. Behind Vanessa, the door opened again. It was Maria, my housekeeper of 20 years. Vanessa had apparently dragged her along to carry the water pitcher and napkins. Maria looked pale. Her hands were trembling as she arranged the napkins on the side table. Maria had been with me since my wife passed away. She had bandaged my wounds, she had cooked my meals, and she had been the only mother figure Brandon had ever really known. "Why is she shaking?" I wondered. "Here, let me help you with that," Douglas, Vanessa said, reaching out to adjust my collar. "Drink up while it is hot." I reached for the blue mug. The steam rising from it smelled of hazelnut, but there was something else underneath, something chemical and faint. Suddenly, there was a crash. Maria had lunged forward with the water pitcher. She didn't trip. I saw her feet. She planted them firmly and threw her body weight into the edge of my chair. Water splashed everywhere, soaking my sleeve and the carpet. "Oh my God, you clumsy idiot!" Vanessa shrieked, her mask of perfection slipping for a second. "I am so sorry, Mr. Douglas," Maria cried, dropping to her knees to dab at the water on my pants with a napkin. I looked down at her, annoyed at the interruption, but then I felt her hand squeeze my knee hard. It was a signal. I froze. Maria leaned in her face inches from mine, pretending to wipe a spot on my jacket. Her eyes were terrified, pleading. The blue cup, she whispered so softly, only I could hear. Don't drink it. Trust me. She pulled back instantly, continuing to apologize loudly. I sat back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a jackhammer. I looked at the blue cup. Then I looked at the red cup sitting in front of Vanessa. Then I looked at Brandon. He wasn't looking at Maria or the spilled water. He was staring at the blue cup with a morbid fascination. They are trying to kill me. The thought didn't come with sadness. It came with a cold, hard rage. I realized in that second that the nervous tapping wasn't anxiety about the job. It was the adrenaline of an executioner. It is fine, Maria, I said, my voice steady. Accidents happen. Go get some dry towels. As Maria rushed out, Vanessa composed herself. She smoothed her dress and forced that smile back onto her face. Well, now that the drama is over, she said, lifting her red cup. Shall we to Brandon King, the new CEO? She turned her head to look at Brandon, beaming at him, urging him to pick up his water glass. This was my moment. I have faced enemy fire. I have negotiated million-dollar deals with union bosses who wanted to break my legs. I know how to create a diversion. I started to cough. It started as a dry hack. Then I ramped it up into a violent fit, my body convulsing. I doubled over, slamming my hand on the table. Dad, are you okay? Brandon asked, half rising from his chair. Vanessa looked at me with disgust, not concern. She turned her head away to avoid my germs, shielding her cup with her hand, but leaving it on the table. In that split second of distraction, while Brandon was looking at my face and Vanessa was looking away in revulsion, my hand moved. It was pure muscle memory, fast and precise. I slid the blue cup to the left. I slid the red cup to the right. The cups were identical in shape, only the color was different. But in the chaos of my coughing fit and the spilled water on the table, the slight movement went unnoticed. I grabbed the napkin Maria had left and wiped my mouth, taking a deep breath. The coughing stopped. Coughing. I am fine, I wheezed, straightening my tie. Just swallowed wrong. Old age catching up to me, right, Vanessa? I reached out and picked up the red cup. Vanessa turned back to me, relief washing over her face. She reached down and picked up the blue cup. The cup that was originally mine. The cup Maria had warned me about. To the future, I said, my eyes locking onto hers. To the future, she echoed. We touched the rims of the mugs together. A soft clink that sounded like the tolling of a bell. I watched her bring the blue cup to her painted lips. I watched her tilt her head back. I watched her swallow. I took a sip from the red cup. It was just coffee. But as Vanessa set the blue cup down empty, a strange silence filled the room. I picked up my pen. So I said, looking at the legal documents that would strip me of everything I built, "Where do I sign?" Brandon let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. "Just right there, Dad, on the dotted line." I lowered the pen to the paper. But I didn't write my name. I just held the tip of the pen there, counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Vanessa started to giggle. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a high-pitched sound like a child seeing a circus clown for the first time. I looked up. Vanessa was staring at her hand, flexing her fingers as if she had never seen them before. "Look, Brandon," she said, her voice slurring. "My fingers. They are snakes. Look at the little snakes." "Vanessa, honey." "What are you talking about?" Brandon asked, his brow furrowing. She stood up abruptly, her chair screeching backward. She swayed on her high heels, her eyes unfocused and wild. "I am the Queen of England," she announced loudly to the empty room. "And you?" She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are a giant toad. Why is there a toad in the boardroom?" "Vanessa, sit down," Brandon shouted, standing up and grabbing her arm. She shoved him away with surprising strength. She climbed onto the mahogany table, sending the tray and the blue cup crashing to the floor. The ceramic shattered. I just sat there sipping my coffee, watching the woman who tried to drug me dance on the table of my company. The drug must have been potent, intended to knock me out or make me look senile in front of the board. But on her smaller frame, it was hitting her like a freight train. The show was just beginning, and I hadn't even signed a damn thing. The warning from Maria echoed in my ears like a gunshot in an empty canyon. Don't drink, trust me. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of stone. I had spent 50 years perfecting that poker face in boardrooms and foxholes alike. Vanessa was watching me with the intensity of a vulture waiting for a wounded animal to finally collapse. Her eyes were fixated on that blue mug. She wasn't just offering coffee. She was offering my demise. I knew I had less than 3 seconds before her suspicion kicked in. I needed a diversion. Not a small one, but something that would break their visual lock on the table. I remembered my time in the service. When you are pinned down, you create smoke. You create noise. You force the enemy to blink. I let out a wheeze. It started low in my throat, a dry, rattling sound that I forced into a violent, racking cough. I hunched over, grabbing my chest with my left hand, while my right hand flailed out, as if searching for support. "Dad, are you okay?" Brandon asked, half rising from his leather chair, his face pale with a mix of panic and guilt. I didn't answer. I ramped up the performance, turning the cough into a spasms that shook my entire upper body. I slammed my open palm onto the polished mahogany table with a thunderous crack. The noise was startling in the quiet room. Vanessa flinched. For a split second, her vanity overrode her malice. She pulled back, turning her face away and shielding her expensive silk dress with her hand, terrified that my germs might touch her pristine outfit. Her eyes squeezed shut in disgust. That was my window. It was pure instinct. My left hand, which had been clutching my chest, swept across the table surface in a clumsy, chaotic motion. I knocked a stack of legal documents onto the floor, creating a cascade of white paper. As Brandon's eyes followed the falling papers and Vanessa remained turned away in revulsion, my right hand moved with the precision of a surgeon. I grabbed the handle of my blue mug and the handle of her red mug. In one fluid motion, I crossed them. Blue went to her side. Red came to mine. The swap took less than a second. By the time the papers hit the carpet, the mugs were sitting peacefully in their new positions, steam still rising in lazy spirals as if nothing had happened. I let out one final dramatic gasp, and then slumped back into my chair, wiping my mouth with a handkerchief I pulled from my pocket. The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and Brandon's heavy breathing. "Jesus. Dad." "You scared the hell out of me," Brandon stammered, bending down to pick up the scattered contracts. "I am fine." I rasped, my voice deliberately rough. "Just went down the wrong pipe. Getting old is not for the weak, son." I looked at Vanessa. She had composed herself, smoothing her hair and checking her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She turned back to the table, her eyes scanning the surface. She looked at the blue mug sitting in front of her, then at the red mug in front of me. She didn't blink. She didn't frown. She had no idea. The arrogance of youth and greed had blinded her. She assumed I was a helpless old man, incapable of sleight of hand. She assumed she was the predator and I was the prey. She didn't realize that the prey had just loaded the gun and handed it back to her. I picked up the red mug. My hand was steady, not a tremor. "I am sorry about the mess," I said, gesturing to the papers Brandon was restacking. "Let's get this over with. I need that caffeine kick if I am going to sign my life away." Vanessa smiled again, that same plastic, chilling smile. She reached out and wrapped her manicured fingers around the warm ceramic of the blue mug. My mug. The poison mug. Yes, let's, she said, lifting the cup in a mock toast. To your retirement, Douglas. You have earned a long, deep rest. I watched her bring the rim to her lips. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel remorse. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of justice being served. To family, I replied and took a long sip of the safe black coffee. She tilted her head back and drank deep. The hazelnut roast was hot and strong, warming my chest as it went down. But the satisfaction I felt had nothing to do with the caffeine. I held the red mug with a steady hand, looking over the rim at Vanessa. She had tilted her head back to drain the very last drop from the blue mug. I watched the muscles in her throat work as she swallowed the sedative she had intended for me. She set the empty cup down on the saucer with a sharp clink, exhaling a long, contented sigh. It was the sound of a woman who believed she had just secured a $50 million fortune. She wiped a smudge of lipstick from the rim, completely unaware that the clock had started ticking on her own public destruction. Dad, please, Brandon interrupted, his voice tight with impatience. We are already 10 minutes behind schedule. The board members are going to start asking questions if we don't go down there soon. Just sign the transfer on the last page. You don't need to read the whole thing again. We went over this with the lawyers yesterday. I lowered my mug slowly, savoring the panic in his eyes. He pushed the heavy document toward me, along with my favorite Mont Blanc fountain pen. He was sweating profusely now, a sheen of perspiration coating his upper lip. He wasn't worried about the board members. He was worried that the drugs wouldn't kick in fast enough, or worse, that I would change my mind before his wife's poison took effect. I picked up the pen. Brandon's shoulders slumped in relief. He thought the game was over. But instead of flipping to the signature page, I turned back to the very first page of the contract. I adjusted my reading glasses deliberately, taking my time to wipe a non-existent speck of dust from the lens. You know, son, I said, keeping my voice low and thoughtful. A wise man once told me that the devil is in the details. I built this company by reading every single line of every single contract. It wouldn't be right to hand over 30 years of sweat and blood without one final review. Oh my God, Douglas just signed the damn paper, Vanessa snapped. Her voice had lost its earlier sweetness. She was massaging her temples, blinking rapidly, as if the lights in the room had suddenly become too bright. I ignored her. I ran my finger down the first paragraph, reading aloud in a slow, monotonous drone. Clause 1, Section A. The transfer of all voting rights and majority stock holdings from Douglas King to Brandon King is contingent upon... Dad, stop! Brandon pleaded, actually reaching out to grab the paper before pulling his hand back. You know what it says. You wrote the terms yourself. I didn't write this part, I thought to myself. I knew exactly what hidden clauses they had buried in the addendum, the ones about mental incapacitation. I was stalling. I needed 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes for the potent cocktail in Vanessa's stomach to hit her bloodstream. I continued to read, pausing to ask clarifying questions about standard legal definitions. I asked about the font size. I asked about the date format. I watched the second hand on the wall clock tick by. Tick, tick, tick. Is anyone else feeling really hot? Vanessa suddenly asked. She tugged at the collar of her designer dress. Her face had flushed a deep, unnatural red. I looked up from the paper. Her eyes were glazed over, swimming in their sockets. She let out a giggle that sounded wet and uncontrolled. The room is spinning, Brandon, she slurred, leaning heavily against the table. Why is the room spinning? Brandon didn't even look at her. He was too focused on the pen in my hand, his greed blinding him to the fact that his wife was about to collapse. I think the coffee is kicking in, I said calmly, looking straight at her. Or maybe it is just the excitement of the day. I looked down at the signature line. The timer in my head hit 0. It was showtime. The chaos that unfolded in the next few minutes was something I will remember until my dying day. It was both a tragedy and a vindication. The drug, whatever heavy sedative cocktail she had mixed, was clearly designed to turn a 72-year-old man into a babbling, incompetent fool. But on a 28-year-old woman with a high metabolism and a stomach full of nothing but ambition and caffeine, the reaction was explosive. Vanessa didn't just stand on the table. She began to strut down the length of the polished mahogany like it was a fashion runway in Milan. Her sharp heels punctured the quarterly reports, leaving little dents in the wood and tearing the financial projections to shreds. "Look at all the little penguins," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the board of directors. "Why are you all wearing tuxedos? Is it time for the circus, Mr. Sterling, the head of our finance department, and a man who has not cracked a smile since 1995, stood up, his face purple with rage. "Brandon, control your wife immediately, or I will have security remove her." Vanessa spun around, losing her balance for a second, before regaining it with a wild, manic laugh. She looked down at Sterling and sneered. "Sit down, you old goblin. Nobody cares about your numbers. We are going to sell it all. We are going to sell the trucks and buy a castle made of marshmallows." Brandon was chasing her around the edge of the table, his hands reaching out uselessly, trying to grab her ankle like a pathetic dog nipping at a mailman. "Vanessa, stop, please, you are sick," he begged, tears actually forming in his eyes. "Get off me!" she yelled, kicking out and catching him square in the chest. She then turned her focus to me. The room fell silent again as she teetered on the edge of the table right in front of my face. She crouched down, her face inches from mine, her breath hot and smelling of the hazelnut coffee she had so eagerly consumed. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris completely. "And you," she whispered loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "You are the biggest ghost of them all. Why won't you just die, Douglas? We dug the hole. We bought the shovel. Why are you still sitting in the chair?" A collective gasp swept through the room. The shareholders looked at each other, horrified. This wasn't just drunkenness. This was a confession bubbling up through a chemically induced psychosis. I didn't blink. I didn't lean back. I just looked at her with the cold detachment of a judge passing a sentence. "I am not a ghost yet, Vanessa," I said softly, "but you are about to become a memory." She recoiled as if I had slapped her. She stood up abruptly, throwing her arms out wide. "I am flying," she screamed, looking up at the ceiling tiles. "I am the golden eagle. Watch me fly away from this dump." She took a running leap towards the chandelier. Of course she didn't make it. She crashed down onto the carpet in a heap of silk and limbs, knocking over 2 leather chairs and a stand containing a priceless Ming vase. The vase survived. Her dignity did not. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the fluorescent lights, laughing hysterically, while tears streamed down her face. It was the sound of a mind completely untethered from reality. "Call 911, one of the board members shouted, pulling out his phone. I remained seated, my hand resting calmly on the unsigned contract. I watched my son kneel beside his wife, not out of love, but out of fear of what she might say next. The irony was bitter. They had wanted a spectacle. They had wanted the board to see a king lose his mind. Well, they got their wish. They just picked the wrong king. The laughter stopped as abruptly as a radio being unplugged. Vanessa collapsed on the center of the mahogany table, her body seizing in a violent rhythm that sent the remaining papers flying like confetti. The foam bubbling at the corners of her mouth was not a figure of speech. It was a visceral, ugly reality that stained the expensive wood of the conference table. Her eyes rolled back into her head, leaving only the whites exposed, making her look like a broken doll discarded by a careless child. "Call them now!" Brandon screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail that grated against my ears. He fell to his knees beside the table, grabbing her hand, which was now clawing involuntarily at the air. He looked at me with wild, accusatory eyes, as if expecting me to do something to fix the monster he had helped create. But I just stood there. I remained the statue of the stoic, concerned father-in-law, while inside my heart was hardening into concrete. The paramedics arrived in less than 7 minutes, but to the board members huddled in the corner, it must have felt like a lifetime. The room smelled of fierce sweat and the lingering hazelnut aroma of the coffee that had almost ended my life. The EMTs were efficient and professional. They loaded Vanessa onto a stretcher, strapping her down as she continued to twitch and moan incoherently about snakes and castles. "I am coming with her," Brandon shouted, scrambling to his feet. He didn't even look at me. He didn't look at the contract that lay unsigned on the floor. He ran out the door, chasing the stretcher, leaving his dignity and his future behind him. When the double doors finally swung shut, the silence that descended on the room was heavier than the storm raging outside. The board members looked at me. These were men and women who controlled millions of dollars, yet they looked terrified. They were waiting for an explanation. They were waiting for me to crumble or to apologize for the spectacle. I did neither. I buttoned my suit jacket and smoothed my tie. My hands were steady. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "It appears my daughter-in-law has had a severe reaction to something. Given the circumstances and the instability displayed by the proposed successor, I am hereby canceling this transfer of power effective immediately." Mr. Sterling cleared his throat nervously. But Douglas, the press release was already scheduled for noon. "Kill it," I ordered. "King Logistics remains under my command until further notice. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a family emergency to attend to." They filed out quickly, grateful to escape the tension. I waited until the last one had left, and the heavy door clicked shut. Finally alone, I walked back to the table. The blue mug sat there, innocuous and deadly. I didn't touch it with my bare skin. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and carefully picked up the mug. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang once. Pike here, the voice on the other end answered, crisp and sharp. "Leonard, it is Douglas," I said, watching the snow fall against the window. "I have a job for you. I need you to come to the office immediately. Bring a toxicology kit and a private investigator." "What happened?" Douglas Pike asked, sensing the tone in my voice. I looked at the blue mug one last time before setting it down safely out of reach. "I just survived an assassination attempt, Leonard. And I want to know exactly what kind of poison a son buys to kill his own father." The war had officially begun. The private wing of Chicago Memorial smelled of lavender and money, but it could not mask the stench of desperation coming off my son. I found Brandon pacing the hallway outside the VIP suite I had paid for. He looked like a man who had just run a marathon in a suit 3 sizes too small. His tie was undone, and his hair, which was usually gelled to perfection, was sticking up in wild tufts where he had been pulling at it. When he saw me walking down the corridor, his eyes widened in panic before he quickly composed his face into a mask of grief. "Dad," he stammered, rushing over but stopping short of hugging me. "Thank God you are here. It has been a nightmare." I kept my hands deep in my pockets, refusing to offer him the comfort he was fishing for. "How is she, Brandon?" I asked, my voice flat. "What did the doctors say caused such a violent reaction?" Brandon wiped his forehead with a trembling hand and looked at the floor. It was hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. She didn't eat breakfast because she was so nervous about the signing. She just fainted, Dad, that is all. It was just a severe drop in glucose. I looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. Low blood sugar did not make people hallucinate about giant toads or try to swing from chandeliers. It was a lazy lie, the kind a child tells when they have broken a vase and claim the wind did it. "That must have been some drop in sugar," I said dryly. "I have never seen hypoglycemia make someone try to fly before." Before Brandon could invent another excuse, the double doors to the suite swung open. Dr. Evans, the chief of internal medicine, and a man I had played golf with for 20 years, stepped out. He held a clipboard against his chest like a shield. He looked at Brandon and then at me, his expression unreadable to the uninitiated eye. "Brandon," Dr. Evans said, his voice professional but cold. "Go sit with your wife." She is waking up, but she is still confused. I need to speak with your father regarding the insurance billing. Brandon hesitated, looking between us like a trapped animal, but he obeyed. He always obeyed authority. As soon as the door clicked shut and Brandon was out of earshot, Dr. Evans dropped the professional mask. He pulled me into a small alcove away from the security cameras. "Douglas," he said, keeping his voice low, "I don't know what kind of game your kids are playing, but that was not low blood sugar." "I know," I replied, leaning against the wall. "Tell me exactly what it was." Dr. Evans looked at his clipboard, then up at me, his eyes grave. "We ran a full toxicology screen. Her blood is saturated with ace-promazine. It is a potent tranquilizer, Douglas. But we do not prescribe it to humans. We give it to horses before surgery to knock them out completely." The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. A horse tranquilizer. They hadn't just wanted to sedate me lightly. They wanted to turn my brain into mush, prop me up like a puppet, and force a signature out of a drooling vegetable. If I had drunk that coffee, my heart likely would have stopped before the meeting even began. "Is she going to make it?" I asked. "She is lucky she has the constitution of an ox," Evans muttered. "She will wake up in a few hours with the worst migraine of her life, but she will live." "But Douglas, if a man of your age and heart history had ingested that amount..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "Thank you, doctor," I said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Keep this between us for now. Put exhaustion on the official chart. I need them to think they got away with it for just a little longer." I walked back toward the VIP suite. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was energized. I now had the medical proof of their treachery. Now it was time to find the paper trail. Leonard Pike walked into the private waiting room of the hospital, holding his leather briefcase like a loaded weapon. He has been my attorney for 30 years, and in that time I have seen him destroy unions, bankrupt competitors, and silence senators without ever raising his voice. But today, as he marched toward me, his face was pale. He didn't ask about Vanessa. He didn't ask about my health. He simply sat down on the uncomfortable plastic chair next to me and placed the unsigned contract on the low table between us. "You need to see this, Douglas," he said, his voice tight. I looked at the document. It was the same transfer of power agreement Brandon had been trying to force me to sign all morning. I had assumed it was a standard template. I had assumed my son was just eager to take the reins. "Turn to page 42, Leonard instructed. "Look at the footer. Section C, paragraph 4. I squinted. The text was microscopic, printed in a light gray ink that was almost invisible against the white paper. It looked like a printing error or a smudge. I reached into my jacket pocket for my reading glasses, the ones I had deliberately toyed with during the meeting to buy time. I leaned in close. What I read made the blood in my veins turn to ice. In the event that the current CEO displays signs of acute cognitive decline, public outbursts of instability, or irrational behavior, documented by at least 2 witnesses, immediate power of attorney and control of all assets, including personal real estate and liquid funds, shall transfer to the designated successor, Brandon King. This transfer is irrevocable and does not require a medical board review. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with the force of a freight train. The heavy dose of horse tranquilizer in my blue mug. The pressure to hold the meeting in front of the entire board of directors. The rush to get everything signed that specific morning. They didn't want to kill me. Murder is messy. Murder triggers police investigations and autopsies. Murder leaves a trail. No, their plan was far more cruel. They wanted to destroy my mind. If I had drunk that coffee, I would have been the one standing on the boardroom table screaming about snakes and kings. I would have been the one stripping off my clothes and attacking the shareholders, and they would have been there recording every single second of it with their phones. They would have had the perfect evidence. See, the poor old man has finally lost it. See how dangerous he is. We have no choice but to take control for his own safety. I sat back in the chair, feeling a cold sweat break out on my neck that had nothing to do with the hospital temperature. They were going to commit me, Leonard, I whispered, the realization tasting like ash in my mouth. They were going to film me having a psychotic break induced by their drugs, use this clause to steal my company and my home, and then lock me away in a facility where no one would ever believe a word I said. Leonard nodded grimly. It is the perfect trap, Douglas. With this clause and a video of you acting insane, they could have legally stripped you of your rights before the drugs even wore off. You would have woken up in a padded room with nothing. I looked down at my hands. These hands had held Brandon when he was a baby. These hands had taught him how to throw a baseball. These hands had signed the checks for his college tuition, his wedding, and his first house. And he had tried to use a piece of paper to bury me alive. The sadness I had felt earlier evaporated completely. In its place, a cold, hard resolve settled over me. They wanted a crazy old man. They wanted a war. Well, I was going to give them one. But I wasn't going to be the one ending up in a cage. Is this document admissible in court? I asked Leonard, my voice steady and low. It is proof of intent to defraud at the very least, Leonard replied, closing his briefcase with a sharp snap. Combined with the toxicology report from Vanessa, it is a smoking gun. Good, I said, standing up and buttoning my jacket. Keep that document safe, Leonard. It is time for me to make a withdrawal from the bank of fatherly love. And I think the account is overdrawn. The key to the penthouse slid into the lock with a smooth, silent mechanism that cost more than my first car. I had bought this $3 million apartment for Brandon and Vanessa as a wedding gift, thinking it would be the foundation of a happy family life. Instead, as I pushed the door open, I was greeted by the smell of stale champagne and expensive perfume masking the underlying scent of rot. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The place was a disaster. It looked less like a home and more like a hotel room trashed by rock stars who didn't have to pay the bill. Designer clothes were strewn across the living room furniture. A $3,000 Hermes bag sat open on the floor, spilling its contents of makeup and crumpled receipts onto the Persian rug. Takeout boxes from the most expensive sushi place in Chicago were piled high on the glass coffee table, fermenting in the heat of the afternoon sun. Maria followed me, and her face pinching with disapproval. She immediately started picking up dirty wine glasses, muttering in Spanish about people who have no respect for labor. Leave it, Maria, I ordered, my voice echoing in the large empty space. I want to remember them exactly like this. Sloppy. Careless. I walked into the kitchen. It was a chef's kitchen equipped with appliances that had likely never been used for anything more complex than reheating leftovers. I opened the refrigerator. It was stocked with nothing but premium vodka, caviar, and bottles of detox juice. There was no real food, no milk, no eggs. It was a kitchen of people who lived for appearance, not for substance. Mr. Douglas, Maria called out from the pantry area. Her voice was sharp, urgent. You need to see this. I walked over. She was standing by the recycling bin, holding a crumpled, glossy brochure that had been tossed in with the empty liquor bottles. She smoothed it out on the granite countertop, her hand trembling slightly. Sunny Meadows Senior Care Facility, the headline read in cheerful yellow font. Affordable care for the twilight years. I picked it up. The paper felt cheap in my hand. I knew Sunny Meadows. It was a state-funded warehouse on the south side of the city, notorious for health code violations and a ratio of 1 nurse for every 50 patients. It was a place where people were sent to be forgotten. A place where the elderly sat in soiled diapers staring at a television that was never turned off, waiting for death to release them. I flipped the brochure over. There were handwritten notes in the margins in Vanessa's distinct, bubbly handwriting. $1,000 a month, she had written next to the pricing tier. Cheap leaves, more for the yacht fund. Below that, she had circled the section on visitation policies. Visiting hours limited to Sundays, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Perfect, she had scrawled. We never have to see him. I looked around the penthouse. I looked at the view of the Chicago skyline framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked at the crystal chandelier hanging above the dining table. I had given them a castle in the sky. I had given them a life of unlimited luxury. And in return, they had budgeted $1,000 a month to rot me in a hellhole. They didn't just want my money. They wanted to erase me. They wanted to throw me into a garbage bin like a used napkin so they could sail away on a yacht bought with the liquidation of my life's work. The sadness I had been holding on to, the tiny flicker of hope that this was all a misunderstanding, finally died. It didn't just fade away. It was extinguished by a wave of pure, cold hatred. Check the trash in the master bedroom, I told Maria, my voice devoid of any emotion. If they have the brochure, they have the application. Find it. Maria dug deeper into the recycling bin, moving aside empty champagne bottles that clinked together like a grotesque celebration of my demise. Her hands shaking, she pulled out a crumpled document stained with coffee grounds and expensive vodka. She smoothed it out on the cold granite countertop and pushed it toward me. It was not a brochure this time. It was an official intake form for Sunny Meadows. I looked down at the paper, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The patient name was printed in block letters. Douglas King. Under the section for reason for admission, someone had checked the box for advanced dementia and aggressive behavior. And then I saw the date. The date of transport was listed as tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. The realization hit me harder than any bullet I took in Vietnam. The coffee in the boardroom wasn't meant to kill me. It was meant to incapacitate me just long enough for them to drag my unconscious body out of my own building and dump me into a state-run facility before the drugs wore off. I would have woken up in a strange bed, surrounded by strangers with no phone, no lawyer, and a medical file saying I was insane. I traced the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Brandon's signature. The same signature I had taught him to write when he was 6 years old, sitting at my knee in my study. Memories flooded my mind, unbidden and painful. I remembered the winter Brandon was 10 and wanted a specialized telescope to see the rings of Saturn. I drove 3 hours in a blizzard to get it for him. I remembered sitting up with him for 3 nights straight when he had pneumonia, holding his hand while his fever broke. I remembered paying off his credit card debt when he was 22 and reckless, telling him that everyone deserves a second chance. I had spent my entire life building a shield around him, protecting him from the harsh realities of the world. I built this company not for the glory, but to give him a legacy, to give him the security I never had growing up poor on the South Side. And this was his repayment, a one-way ticket to a warehouse for the dying. I looked around the penthouse again. This apartment alone cost more than the entire budget of the facility he was sending me to. He was willing to let me rot in filth, wearing second-hand clothes and eating gruel just so he could keep living in this marble palace without my oversight. A strange sound escaped my throat. It wasn't a sob. It was a dry, bitter laugh. The father in me wanted to weep. The father in me wanted to ask where I went wrong and how my sweet boy turned into a monster. But the father in me died in that moment, standing in that soulless kitchen. The man who remained was Douglas King, the Marine, the CEO, the man who destroyed his competition without blinking. I picked up the intake form. I didn't crumble it. I folded it neatly and placed it in my inside jacket pocket next to my heart. It wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was evidence. Maria was watching me, tears streaming down her face, waiting for me to break down. But I straightened my spine. The pain in my chest cooled rapidly, hardening into a block of ice. I felt a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "Dry your eyes, Maria," I said, my voice dropping an octave, steady and commanding. "We are done crying for people who are already dead to us." I walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face, washing away the last traces of the shock. When I looked up in the mirror, the eyes staring back at me weren't the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of an executioner. "Let's go," I said, turning toward the door. "I have a son to disown." The paper in my hand felt heavier than the rucksack I carried through the jungles of Vietnam. It was just a thin sheet of cheap copy paper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of failure. I closed my eyes, and for a terrifying moment, the smell of stale champagne and expensive perfume in the penthouse faded away, replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of antiseptic and bleach. I was back in the oncology ward at St. Mary's 20 years ago. The hum of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, a slow, rhythmic countdown to the end of my world. Martha, my beautiful Martha, looked so small in that hospital bed. The cancer had stolen her strength, her hair, and her future, but it hadn't touched the fierce love in her eyes. She had gripped my hand, her fingers cold and fragile like porcelain. "Douglas," she had whispered, her voice barely a rustle of dry leaves. "Promise me. Promise me you will look after him. He is so sensitive, Douglas. He needs you. Don't let the world break him." I had squeezed her hand until my knuckles turned white, tears streaming down my face. "I promise, Martha," I had choked out. "I will give him the world. I will make sure he never knows a day of hardship." I opened my eyes, and the sterile white room vanished. I was back in the marble kitchen of the monster I had created. I had kept my promise to Martha. God help me, I had kept it too well. I had taken her dying wish and twisted it into a curse. I had shielded Brandon from every consequence, every struggle, and every lesson. When he crashed his car, I bought him a new one. When he failed his classes, I made a donation to the college. I thought I was protecting him, but I was only feeding the parasite that would eventually try to consume me. I walked over to the deep farmhouse sink. My reflection in the window was dark and hollow, a ghost of the man who had sat by that hospital bed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old silver Zippo lighter. It was one of the few things I owned that wasn't bought with King Logistics money. It was scratched and dented a survivor just like me. I flicked the wheel. The flames sprang to life, dancing yellow and blue in the silent kitchen. I held the corner of the admission form to the fire. I watched the flame catch. It started slow, licking at the edge of the paper, and then it surged hungrily, consuming the words "Sunny Meadows." I watched the fire eat through the checkbox for dementia. I watched it scorch the date of transport. Finally, I watched it burn through Brandon's signature. The paper curled and blackened, turning into fragile gray ash that crumbled into the sink. I didn't feel the heat against my fingers until the very last second. I dropped the burning remnant and turned on the faucet, watching the water wash the black sludge down the drain. As the last of the ash disappeared, something inside me broke. But it wasn't a break that weakened me. It was the snapping of a chain. The heavy, suffocating chain of guilt I had dragged around since Martha died was gone. I looked up at the ceiling, speaking to a woman who had been gone for 2 decades. "I am sorry, Martha," I whispered into the empty room. "I kept my promise. I took care of the boy you left behind. But that boy is gone. The thing that lives in this penthouse, the thing that tried to poison me and lock me away in a cage, is not our son." I turned off the faucet with a sharp twist. "The boy I raised died today," I said, my voice dropping to a gravelly growl. "And the man who is left is going to learn that the world breaks everyone, especially those who think they are untouchable." I dried my hands on a kitchen towel and threw it on the floor. I was done with grief. It was time for war. I walked out of that kitchen, leaving the smell of burnt paper and betrayal behind me. I pulled my phone from my breast pocket and dialed Leonard Pike. He answered on the first ring, knowing that things were escalating quickly. "Leonard," I said, my voice devoid of the fatherly warmth that had defined me for 30 years. "I am initiating the scorching earth protocol." There was a pause on the other end. Leonard knew exactly what that meant. It was a strategy we had used only once before against a hostile corporate takeover in the 90s. It meant total financial annihilation. "Are you sure?" Douglas Leonard asked, his voice low. "Once we pull this trigger, there is no going back. Brandon will be destitute within the hour." I walked past the living room where my son's expensive golf clubs sat in the corner. I looked at the painting I had bought them for their anniversary. Every object in that room was a testament to my generosity and their greed. "I am not just sure, Leonard, I am eager. I want you to freeze everything." I continued pacing the marble floor. "I want the Amex Black cards canceled immediately. Not suspended, canceled. I want the trust fund access revoked. I want the monthly allowance transfer stopped. I want the company fuel cards deactivated." I stopped at the front door and looked at Maria, who was standing there with her coat on, ready to leave this house of lies with me. "And Leonard," I added, a cruel smile touching my lips, "I want you to call the security team at the building. Tell them the lease on the penthouse has been terminated effective immediately. Change the digital locks. When they come back from the hospital, expecting to sleep in their $1 million bed, I want their codes to fail. I want them to realize they are homeless, standing in the hallway." "Understood," Leonard replied, the sound of keyboard clicking in the background, confirming that my orders were already being executed. "What about the hospital bill?" "Let it bounce," I said. "Let them feel the weight of their own choices. If they want to drug me and throw me in a state facility, they can pay for their own recovery. I want them to walk out of that hospital and try to buy a bottle of water and realize they are worth less than the plastic bottle it comes in." I hung up the phone. I felt a surge of adrenaline that I hadn't felt since I was a young man building my empire. The sadness was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a general at war. Maria opened the door for me. "Mr. Douglas," she said softly. "Where are we going?" "We are going to war." "Maria," I said, stepping out into the hallway. "But first, we are going to get a steak dinner. I have a feeling I am going to need my strength." As we rode the elevator down, I imagined the scene that was about to unfold. Brandon waking up thinking he had won. Vanessa thinking she was the new queen of Chicago. And then the slow, terrifying realization that the bank accounts were empty and the gates were locked. They had tried to take my life. Now I was going to take their lifestyle. And frankly, I wasn't sure which one they valued more. I walked out of the building into the biting Chicago wind. It was cold, but for the first time all day I felt warm. The fire was back in my belly. Douglas King was not dead. He was just getting started. While I was sitting in a leather booth at Gibson's Steakhouse staring at a dry-aged ribeye that cost more than my first car, Brandon was standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital billing department. I wasn't there physically, but I knew the script by heart. I had written it myself when I made that phone call to Leonard Pike. The bill for the VIP suite, the emergency toxicology screening, and the discreet silence of the medical staff had come to $12,000. For Brandon, that amount usually meant nothing more than a signature and a dismissive wave of his hand. He walked up to the discharge counter with the arrogance of a man who has never checked a price tag in his life. He reached into his Italian leather wallet and pulled out the heavy black titanium Centurion card, the card that opens doors closed to regular mortals, the card that says, "I own the world." He slid it across the marble counter to the receptionist, not even breaking eye contact with his phone. "Run it," he said casually, "and add 20% for yourself." The receptionist smiled, that tight, polite smile reserved for rich, rude customers. She inserted the card into the chip reader. I imagine the silence that followed lasted exactly 5 seconds. Then came the beep. It wasn't the happy chirp of an approval. It was the low, harsh buzz of a rejection. Brandon frowned, tapping his phone. "Try it again," he said, annoyed. "The chip is probably dirty." She tried it again. This time she looked at the screen and then up at Brandon. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of professional awkwardness. "Mr. King, I am sorry," she said. "The terminal is giving me a code 04. That means pickup card." "What does that mean?" Brandon snapped, finally looking up from his screen. "It means the issuer has ordered us to confiscate the card immediately, sir." Brandon laughed. A nervous, incredulous laugh. "That is ridiculous. My father owns the bank practically. Give me that back." He reached for the card, but the receptionist pulled it away, sliding it into a locked slot under the counter. "I cannot do that, sir. It is bank property now. Do you have another form of payment?" His face turning a dangerous shade of red, Brandon pulled out his platinum card, then his gold business card, then even the emergency debit card I had set up for him when he was in college. Declined. 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 People in the line behind him started to shift and whisper. The shame was beginning to creep up his neck. He was no longer the heir to the King Empire. He was just a guy in a wrinkled suit who couldn't pay his bill. He snatched his phone and dialed the private line of our family banker. He put it on speaker, presumably to intimidate the receptionist with his connections. "Charles, what the hell is going on?" Brandon shouted as soon as the line connected. "Every single one of my cards is bouncing. Fix it! Now!" The voice on the other end was calm, but it lacked the usual obsequious warmth Brandon was used to. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Brandon." "What do you mean you cannot do it?" "Do you know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," the banker replied, his voice amplified for the entire billing department to hear. "But the primary account holder, Douglas King, called me 20 minutes ago. He has removed you as an authorized user on all accounts. He has also frozen the trust disbursements and flagged your personal accounts for audit due to suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" Brandon stammered, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Yes. Embezzlement is considered suspicious activity," the banker said coldly. "Good luck, Brandon." The line went dead. Brandon stood there holding a silent phone while the receptionist looked at him with pity. "I am sorry, sir," she said, sliding the invoice toward him. "But we are going to need a valid credit card, or we will have to call security." At the steakhouse, my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. "Authorization denied. Hospital billing. $12,000. I took a sip of my red wine. It tasted like victory. The financial umbilical cord had finally been cut. The migraine that greeted Vanessa as she regained consciousness in the hospital room must have felt like a sledgehammer to the skull. Dr. Evans had warned me that the horse tranquilizer would leave a nasty hangover, and frankly, I hoped it hurt. I hoped every throb of her head reminded her of the poison she tried to slip past my lips. According to the updates I was receiving from my security team, she didn't wake up with remorse. She woke up with demands. She screamed at the nurses for water. She demanded to be taken home immediately, claiming the hospital sheets were too scratchy for her delicate skin. She had no idea that scratchy sheets were about to become the least of her problems. Brandon managed to scrape together enough cash from his pockets to pay for a taxi. It must have been a humiliating ride for a couple used to being chauffeured in a climatized Mercedes. They arrived at the exclusive Lakeshore Drive building just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the city they thought they owned. I can picture the scene perfectly. Vanessa stumbling slightly in her designer heels, leaning on Brandon for support, desperate to collapse into her king-sized bed, with the Egyptian cotton linens I had paid for. They bypassed the doorman. Or rather, the doorman who had been an employee of mine for 15 years deliberately looked the other way. He knew better than to engage with trespassers. They took the private elevator up to the 45th floor, the silence of the lift, likely filled with Vanessa's complaints about the hospital staff, and Brandon's terrified silence. He hadn't told her yet. He hadn't told her about the credit cards. He hadn't told her about the bank accounts. He was praying that the apartment was still safe, a fortress where they could hide and figure out a plan. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Usually, stepping out into that hallway meant stepping into a private foyer decorated with fresh orchids and soft lighting. Today, it looked like a loading dock. Piled high against the walls were dozens of brown cardboard boxes. They were stacked haphazardly, some taping already coming loose. There were no labels, no fragile stickers, just their entire materialistic lives shoved into boxes by a moving crew I had hired to be fast, not careful. "What is this?" Vanessa whispered, her voice rasping from the dry throat caused by the drugs. "Why is our stuff in the hallway?" Brandon didn't answer. He rushed to the double doors of the penthouse. He punched in the 6-digit code. The code was their wedding date, a date I paid for. The keypad flashed red. A low, mocking buzz echoed in the hallway. He tried again, his fingers trembling. Beep, 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 buzz. "It's not working," he panicked, rattling the handle. Dad must have changed the code. Vanessa pushed him aside, her anger temporarily overriding her exhaustion. "Let me do it, you idiot. You're probably typing it wrong." She punched in the numbers. Again the red light. Again the denial. Then she saw the piece of paper taped to the mahogany finish of the door. It wasn't a handwritten note. It was a formal legal notice on the letterhead of Pike & Associates. "Notice of lease termination." She read, her voice shaking. "Occupants are hereby evicted effective immediately due to violation of lease terms regarding criminal conduct on the premises. All personal property has been removed to the corridor. Trespassers will be arrested." She stared at the paper. Then she stared at the mountain of boxes. Her designer wardrobe, her jewelry, her collection of imported shoes, all thrown into cardboard like garbage. "Where are we supposed to sleep?" she screamed, turning to Brandon. Brandon looked at the locked door, then at his wife. For the first time, he realized that without my name, he was just a man standing in a hallway with a pile of boxes and nowhere to go. "Call him, Vanessa!" shrieked, kicking a box. "Call your father right now and tell him to open this door." Brandon pulled out his phone. But he knew, just as I knew sitting in my office across town, that nobody was going to answer. The King Castle had raised its drawbridge. I can only imagine the walk of shame they took from the 45th floor down to the parking garage. My head of security. Mike later told me that Vanessa threatened to sue him 3 times before they reached the elevator, but Mike just smiled and pointed toward the exit. They left the mountain of boxes behind, taking only what they could carry, which was essentially their bruised egos and a few designer handbags that were now completely useless to them. They retreated to the parking garage where Brandon's Porsche Cayenne was parked. It was the only asset I hadn't seized yet, mostly because I wanted to let them feel a false sense of security before I took that too. But for tonight, it was their only shelter. A $100,000 SUV is a status symbol when you are driving it to a gala, but when you are trying to sleep in it during a Chicago winter, it is just a freezing metal box with leather seats that don't recline quite far enough. They climbed inside, slamming the doors against the biting wind. Brandon turned the key to start the engine and get the heater running. The fuel light pinged immediately. "Low range." "We can't run the heat," Vanessa Brandon said, his voice trembling. "We have less than 10 miles of gas left, and I don't have a single dollar to fill it up. If we run out of gas, we are stranded." Vanessa screamed. It wasn't a word, it was a primal sound of frustration and rage. She punched the dashboard, her diamond ring leaving a scratch on the leather that would have cost $500 to fix yesterday. "This is your fault," she hissed, turning on him in the cramped darkness of the cabin. "You told me he was soft. You told me he would just sign the papers and go play golf. You didn't tell me your father was a psychopath who would lock us out of our own home. He is not a psychopath." Brandon shot back, his own temper finally flaring up under the pressure. "He is awake, Vanessa. He is awake because you messed up the dosage. You were supposed to make him confused, not turn him into a raving lunatic in front of the board. You pushed it too far. Oh, so now you are a doctor, Vanessa laughed cruelly. You were happy enough to go along with it when I promised you the CEO title. You were measuring the curtains for the corner office while I was doing the dirty work. And now that it has gone wrong, you are crying like a baby. Do something, Brandon. Fix this. Fix what Brandon yelled, hitting the steering wheel. I have no money. I have no home. I can't even buy a burger because my father locked every single account. We are homeless, Vanessa. Do you understand that? We are homeless in a Porsche. I am not homeless, Vanessa spat, crossing her arms and shivering as the temperature inside the car began to drop. I am Vanessa King. I am the future of this family. And tomorrow morning I am going to go to the press, and I am going to destroy that old man. She reclined her seat as far as it would go, turning her back to him. Brandon sat there, gripping the steering wheel in the dark, listening to the wind howl through the concrete structure of the garage. He probably thought about driving to a friend's house, but he quickly realized he didn't have any friends. He had drinking buddies. He had people who liked his money. But he didn't have a single person who would open their door to a disinherited fraud at 2 a.m. So he sat there in the cold, watching his breath fog up the windshield, waiting for a morning that would bring no relief. He thought the night was the rock bottom. He had no idea that I had barely started digging. The lobby of King Logistics is a cathedral of glass and steel designed to intimidate competitors and impress investors. At 9 a.m, it is usually a symphony of polished shoes clicking on marble and the low hum of billion-dollar deals being discussed in hushed tones. But on this particular Tuesday, the atmosphere was shattered by the arrival of 2 people who looked like they had been chewed up by the city and spit back out. Brandon and Vanessa marched through the revolving doors with the aggressive entitlement of people who refuse to believe their reign is over. But the illusion was broken the moment the sunlight hit them. Brandon's suit, the one he had worn to the failed signing ceremony yesterday, was wrinkled and stained with sweat. Vanessa's hair, usually a helmet of perfection, was a tangled mess, and her mascara had smeared into dark circles around her eyes, making her look like a deranged raccoon. They didn't look like royalty anymore. They looked like crash test dummies who had survived the impact but lost their minds. They headed straight for the executive elevators, bypassing the security desk entirely. Mr. King. Mrs. King, please stop the receptionist. Sarah called out, her voice trembling. You need to sign in. Brandon didn't even look at her. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the elevator call button. Sign in, he shouted back, his voice cracking. I am the CEO of this company. I don't sign in. He reached the elevators and jabbed his finger against the button. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, harder this time. The light didn't turn on. The sensor didn't beep. The system had been scrubbed of his biometrics hours ago. Open the damn door, Brandon screamed, kicking the stainless steel panel. That was when the wall-saw of muscle known as Mike, my head of security, stepped in front of them. Mike is 6'4" and built like a vending machine made of concrete. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked down at my son. Step away from the elevators, Brandon Mike said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of finality. Get out of my way, Mike, Brandon spat, stepping into the big man's personal space. Do you want to lose your job? I will fire you right here. I will burn your pension. You don't have the authority to fire a vending machine, let alone me, Mike replied without blinking. Your access has been revoked. You are trespassing. By now, the entire lobby had ground to a halt. 200 employees were standing frozen, holding their lattes and briefcases, watching the spectacle. Phones were out. The cameras were rolling. The whispers started like the buzzing of locusts. Is that Brandon? Look at his clothes. Is he drunk? Vanessa, seeing the audience, decided to play the victim card. She threw herself against Mike's chest, pounding on him with her weak fists. This is illegal, she shrieked. You are kidnapping our company. We built this place. Suddenly, a soft chime cut through the noise. It was a singular, clear note that instantly silenced the room. The center elevator. The private one. The one with gold doors that only opened for one person. The doors slid apart smoothly. I stepped out. I had spent an extra 30 minutes getting ready that morning. I was wearing my best navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that cost more than the car they had slept in. I had shaved closely and polished my shoes until they mirrored the fear in their eyes. I didn't look like a victim. I didn't look like a frail old man who needed a nursing home. I looked like the king. I walked slowly toward them, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. The clicking of my cane on the marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. I stopped 5 feet away from them. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my hands. I just looked at them with a disappointment so profound it sucked the air out of the room. "You are causing a scene, Brandon," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "And you know how much I hate a mess in my lobby." "You are right, Brandon," I said, my voice carrying to the back of the atrium without the need for a microphone. "You are the director of sales, or at least you were until 9 o'clock this morning." Brandon stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, like a fish out of water. He looked around at the hundreds of employees watching us. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry, nervous choke. "Dad, stop joking," he whispered, stepping closer so only I could hear. "You are embarrassing the family. Just tell Mike to let us up, and we can talk about this in private." "There is no private anymore," I replied, stepping back so he couldn't touch me. "You wanted to be a public figure, Brandon. You wanted the title, the corner office, and the glory. So let us give the people what they want. Let us give them the truth." I turned to the reception desk where Sarah was watching with wide eyes, holding her hand over her mouth. "Sarah," I commanded, "pull up the forensic accounting report I emailed you 10 minutes ago. Put it on the main lobby screen." Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, but she feared me far more than she feared the sweating man in the wrinkled suit. She typed a command. The massive LED screen behind the reception desk, usually reserved for welcoming clients and displaying stock prices, flickered. Suddenly, a spreadsheet appeared. It was blown up large enough for everyone to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "What is that?" Vanessa screeched, trying to shield the screen with her body, as if she could block the view of 300 people. "Turn it off right now." I pointed my cane at the screen. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why there were no Christmas bonuses last year." The murmuring in the lobby turned into an angry roar. I watched the realization dawn on the faces of the truck drivers, the dispatchers, and the administrative staff. "Line item 4, I read aloud, my voice cutting through the noise. $212,000 transferred to a shell company in the Cayman Islands." I looked at Brandon. He was shrinking. He was physically deflating under the weight of the accusation. "And where did that money go, son?" I asked. "Did it go to charity? Did it go to innovation?" "No. It went to highstakespoker.com. "Liar," Brandon screamed, his face purple. "That is a lie. He is making it up." "The digital footprint does not lie," I said coldly. "You stole from the people who built this company to fund your gambling addiction. You stole from the drivers who drive through blizzards. You stole from the mechanics who work double shifts. And you did it while sitting in a penthouse paid for by me." I reached out my hand, palm open. "Give it to me," I ordered. "Give you what?" Brandon stammered, tears mixing with the sweat on his face. "Your badge," I said, "and your company phone, and the keys to the office. You are terminated for cause effective immediately, Brandon. You are no longer an employee of King Logistics. If you set foot on this property again without an invitation, you will be arrested for corporate espionage and theft." Brandon looked at me, pleading. He looked for the father who had always bailed him out, the father who had covered up his drunk driving, the father who had paid his debts. But that father was gone. Trembling, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the security badge, the badge that said, Director of Sales. He dropped it into my hand. "Get out," I whispered, "before I call the police and add embezzlement to the list of your problems." The walk from the reception desk to the revolving glass doors was less than 50 feet, but for my son and his wife it must have felt like a march to the gallows. The silence in the lobby was absolute. 300 employees watched them go. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody offered a sympathetic glance. The only sound was the clicking of Vanessa's heels and the heavy, defeated breathing of a man who had just lost his kingdom. I stood my ground, leaning on my cane, watching them push through the glass doors and out into the biting cold of the Chicago morning. They probably thought the humiliation was over. They probably thought they could just jump into their luxury vehicles and speed away to lick their wounds in private. But I am a man who believes in thoroughness. As soon as they stepped onto the curb, a loud hydraulic whine cut through the city noise. A massive flatbed tow truck with the logo of a repossession agency I had personally contracted was already backing up toward the VIP parking spots. Brandon stopped dead in his tracks. His Porsche Cayenne, the one he had slept in the night before, was already being hooked up to the winch. A burly man in a neon vest was securing the chains around the rear axle. "Hey," Brandon shouted, running forward and waving his arms like a maniac. "Get away from my car!" "What are you doing? That is private property." The tow truck driver didn't even look up. He just pointed a gloved hand toward the windshield. "Check the VIN number, buddy," he grunted. "This vehicle is registered to King Logistics. I have a seizure order signed by the CEO." "No, no, no," Vanessa screamed, running toward her white Mercedes convertible, which was parked right next to the Porsche. Another driver was already putting the wheel dollies under her tires. "You cannot take my car. My purse is in there. My makeup is in there." "Company property," the driver said simply. "Personal items will be bagged and left at the security desk. You can pick them up in 24 hours. Brandon tried to grab the driver's arm, but the man spun around. He was a head shorter than Brandon, but twice as wide, and he looked like he ate guys in suits for breakfast. "Touch me again, and you go for a ride in the back of a police cruiser," the driver warned. "Step back." I watched through the glass wall of the lobby as my son and daughter-in-law stood helpless on the sidewalk. They watched the winch cable tighten. They watched the suspension of their beloved cars groan under the strain. Slowly, agonizingly, the symbols of their status were lifted into the air. The Porsche went first, followed by the Mercedes. Within 5 minutes, the truck rumbled away, leaving an empty parking space and a cloud of diesel fumes. Now came the final act of this tragedy. Brandon pulled out his phone, presumably to call a luxury ride-share service. I saw him tapping furiously. Then I saw him stare at the screen. Then he tapped again. I smiled. The corporate Uber account had been disabled, and his personal cards were frozen. He couldn't even hail a ride. A beat-up yellow taxi with a dented fender rolled up to the curb. The driver rolled down the window, chewing on a toothpick. "You folks need a ride or what?" he yelled. Brandon looked at the taxi with disdain. He looked at Vanessa, who was shivering in the cold wind, her arms wrapped around herself. He patted his pockets. He pulled out his wallet, but it was useless plastic. He reached into his pants pocket and pulled out a handful of crumpled bills and loose change. It was probably lunch money, maybe $20 in ones and fives. He counted it out, his hands shaking. He said something to the driver, who shrugged and unlocked the back door. I watched the former director of sales and the woman who wanted to be queen crawl into the back of a smelling taxi that had seen better decades. As the cab pulled away, merging into the dirty slush of the city traffic, I turned my back on the window. "Sarah, clean up this mess," I said to the receptionist, pointing at the floor where Brandon had stood. "And get me a coffee. A fresh cup. I have a company to run." I thought I had stripped them of their weapons when I took their credit cards and their cars. I forgot that in this modern age, the most dangerous weapon is not a gun or a checkbook. It is a smartphone with an internet connection and a woman with no shame. I was sitting in my office reviewing the quarterly projections when Sarah, my secretary, rushed in. She didn't knock. Her face was pale, and she was holding her tablet like it was a bomb that was about to detonate. She didn't say a word, she just placed it on my mahogany desk and pressed play. On the screen was Vanessa. But it wasn't the Vanessa who had screamed at me in the lobby. This was a transformed woman. She was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt that looked threadbare and cheap. Her hair, usually sprayed into a helmet of perfection, was messy and tied back loosely. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, making her look young, vulnerable, and incredibly sad. She was sitting on the edge of a bed in what looked like a cheap motel room, with peeling yellow wallpaper visible in the background. The lighting was dim, casting shadows that emphasized the bags under her eyes. She was crying. Not the hysterical screaming I saw in the boardroom, but soft, silent tears that rolled down her cheeks for maximum effect. "I am so sorry," she whispered to the camera, her voice breaking perfectly. "I didn't want to make this public. We are private people. But we have nowhere else to go, and I am scared. Last night, Douglas King, my father-in-law, threw us out on the street. He took our home. He took our car. He left us with nothing but the clothes on our backs." I watched with a cold detachment, marveling at her acting skills. She paused to wipe her nose with her sleeve, a gesture designed to elicit sympathy from the masses. Then came the masterstroke, the lie that would turn the entire city against me. She reached out of the frame and picked up a small white plastic stick. "A pregnancy test." "He knows I am pregnant," she sobbed, holding the test up to the camera lens so the 2 pink lines were clearly visible. "I told him yesterday. I told him I was carrying his first grandchild. I thought he would be happy. I thought he would want to protect his legacy. Instead, he laughed. He told me he hoped the cold weather would take care of the problem." The breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen. I knew Vanessa. I knew she hated children. She had once called them parasites that ruin your figure. Yet there she was, cradling her stomach with a protective hand, looking like the Virgin Mary of the Motel 6. The comments section on the side of the video was scrolling so fast, it was a blur of rage. "Monster. Boycott King Logistics. Someone needs to go save that baby. I hope that old man rots in hell." It was a digital lynch mob, and they were coming for my head with pitchforks made of hashtags. My office phone started ringing. Then my cell phone. Then the landline at the reception desk outside. It wasn't the bank this time. It was the PR department. It was the major shareholders. It was the news outlets. I looked at the woman on the screen. She had played the ultimate card. She had turned my justice into cruelty. She had turned my victory into a public relations nightmare. I turned off the tablet, silencing her lies, but the damage was already done. The stock ticker on my wall monitor blinked red. King Logistics was down 3 points in 10 minutes. She wanted a war of perception. Fine. But she forgot one thing. If you are going to lie about a pregnancy, you better make sure the man you are fighting doesn't own the best private investigators in the country. Tuy đây là nội dung chi tiết cho đoạn 19 được viết bằng tiếng Anh theo phong cách từ sự tập trung vào diễn biến tâm lý và hành động tối ưu cho việc đọc voice over AI. I sat alone in my office staring at the paused image on the tablet. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Outside the glass walls of my empire, the world was screaming for my head, but in here, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I looked at the small plastic stick in Vanessa's hand. 2 pink lines. A positive result. A grandchild. For 72 years, I have been a man of logic. I deal in hard numbers, in logistics, in concrete facts. But looking at that grainy video image, something cracked inside the fortress I had built around my emotions. A baby. My son's child. The continuation of the King bloodline. I turned to the silver-framed photograph on my desk. It was the last picture taken of Martha before the cancer took her. She was smiling, holding a stuffed teddy bear she had bought for a grandchild she never got to meet. How many nights had we sat on the porch talking about the day the house would be filled with the sound of running feet again? How many times had I promised her that I would pass everything down to the next generation? If Vanessa was telling the truth, then I had just thrown my unborn grandson out into the freezing Chicago winter. The intercom buzzed, jarring me back to reality. It was Sarah. "Mr. King," she said, her voice trembling. "The board members are on line 1, and there are 3 news vans parked at the main gate. They are blocking the delivery trucks." I looked up at the wall monitor. The stock ticker for King Logistics, usually a steady green line climbing upward, was plummeting like a stone dropped in a well. Down 4%, down 6%, down 8%. In 20 minutes of a tearful live stream, that woman had wiped out $300 million of market value. The internet is a cruel judge and jury. I scrolled through the comments. Heartless old miser. He cares more about his money than his family. Boycott King. Hope he dies alone. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the drugs in the coffee. They didn't know about the nursing home brochure. They only saw a crying pregnant woman and a billionaire villain. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city. The doubt was a physical pain in my chest. What if I was wrong? What if the drugs were just a stupid mistake? What if she really was pregnant? Could I live with myself, knowing I risked the health of the only heir I might ever have? My hand hovered over the phone. I wanted to call them. I wanted to send a car to pick them up. I wanted to bring them back to the warmth, not for Brandon, not for Vanessa, but for the innocent life she claimed to be carrying. But then I remembered the look in her eyes during the live stream. For a split second between the sobs, I saw it. A flash of triumph, a glint of calculation. It was the look of a poker player who knows they just laid down a royal flush. I sank back into my leather chair, rubbing my temples. I was trapped. If I ignored her, the company stock would continue to tank, and my reputation would be destroyed. If I took her back, I might be inviting a viper back into my bed. I needed advice. Not from a banker, not from a publicist. I needed the only man who was as cynical and ruthless as I was. I pressed the button for the direct line to legal. "Leonard," I said when he answered, "get over here. We have a hostage situation, and the hostage is my conscience." Leonard Pike sat across from me in my office, and he did not look like a man who was winning. He looked at the red line on the stock ticker, and then he looked at me with the weary expression of a general who realizes he is fighting on the wrong battlefield. He told me that in the court of law, we had a winning case. We had the toxicology report and the nursing home application. But in the court of public opinion, I was already hanging from the gallows. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and gave me the advice I least wanted to hear. "You have to bring them in, Douglas." I slammed my hand on the desk. "Absolutely not. I will not have those vipers back in my house. I will not sleep under the same roof as the woman who tried to drug me into an asylum." Leonard held up a hand to stop me. "I am not saying you give them the keys to the castle. I am saying you offer a ceasefire. If Vanessa is lying, we will expose her and destroy her later. But right now, if she miscarries due to stress, the world will blame you. You will be the billionaire monster who killed his own grandson. Is that the legacy you want?" The room went silent. The word grandson hung in the air like heavy smoke. It was the one weakness in my armor. I could handle losing money. I could handle losing my reputation. But I could not handle the possibility that I might be harming my own flesh and blood. Even if there was only a 1% chance she was telling the truth, I had to take it. "Fine," I growled. "But they do not set foot in the main residence. They can stay in the guest cottage at the south end of the estate." The guest cottage was a small two-bedroom structure near the service entrance. It was built for the groundskeeper originally. It was clean and warm, but it was miles away from the marble floors and silk sheets of the penthouse. It was a place for employees, not for royalty. "Make the call," I told Leonard, "but tell them there are conditions, strict ones." 2 hours later, a taxi pulled up to the iron gates of my estate. I watched from the security monitors in my study. Vanessa stepped out first. She was still wearing the oversized sweatshirt from her video, but the pathetic, sad look was gone. In its place was a smug satisfaction. She walked through the gates with her head high, looking at the main house like she was already measuring it for drapes. She thought she had won. She thought I had folded. I met them at the door of the guest cottage. I stood on the porch, blocking the entrance with my cane. I didn't invite them in. I didn't offer to help with their bags. "Listen to me closely," I said, my voice cutting through the cold wind. "This is not a reconciliation. This is a medical observation unit. You are here because of the child. That is it." Brandon tried to speak. "Dad, we just want to say." I silenced him with a look. "I am not finished. You have a roof over your heads and food in the fridge. In exchange, you give me total silence. No interviews, no social media posts, no crying live streams. If I see a single tweet or hear a whisper of this arrangement in the press, you will be out on the street in 5 minutes, pregnant or not. Do you understand?" Vanessa looked at the small cottage behind me. I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She wanted the mansion. She wanted the staff. But she knew she had no leverage. "We understand, Douglas," she said, her voice dripping with fake humility. "We just want what is best for the baby." "Good," I said, stepping aside. "Then get inside. And don't get comfortable." I watched them drag their bags into the small cottage. As the door closed, I felt a strange sense of calm. Leonard thought I was bringing them in to protect my reputation. He was wrong. I was bringing them in because it is much easier to catch a rat when you lock it in a cage where you can watch its every move. They thought they were safe. They had no idea they had just walked into the best surveillance trap money could buy. The guest cottage was designed for comfort, but for two people accustomed to a 4,000-square-foot penthouse, it must have felt like a shoebox. I appointed Maria as their sole point of contact. To Brandon and Vanessa, she was just the maid coming to change the sheets and stock the refrigerator. They ignored her presence, treating her with the same invisible disdain they always had. That was their mistake. They forgot that the person who cleans your room sees everything you try to hide. To me, Maria was not just a housekeeper. She was my eyes and ears inside the enemy camp. It didn't take long for the cracks in their performance to show. On the second afternoon of their confinement, Maria went down to the cottage to deliver a basket of fresh fruit and vitamins. I had insisted on the vitamins as part of the charade of caring for the pregnancy. When she entered the living room, she found Vanessa passed out on the small floral sofa. The television was blaring a reality show, and Brandon was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in the bedroom to avoid his wife. Maria noticed a bottle of premium mineral water sitting on the coffee table next to Vanessa's limp hand. It was the expensive kind in the glass bottle that Vanessa insisted was the only thing that could touch her lips. Maria reached out to tidy up, intending to put the bottle in the recycling bin. But as she lifted it, she noticed the cap had been broken and resealed clumsily. She twisted it open. The smell that wafted out was not the clean scent of spring water. It was the sharp, stinging odor of vodka. Cheap vodka. Maria told me later that her hands shook with rage. She is a deeply religious woman, and the idea that a mother would poison her unborn child with alcohol was a sin she could not comprehend. She capped the bottle and put it back exactly where she found it. She didn't wake Vanessa. She didn't confront Brandon. She came straight back to the main house and marched into my study. "She is drinking Mr. Douglas," she said, her voice hard as steel. She is drinking vodka out of water bottles. If there is a baby in there, she is killing it. I listened to her report, and I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Part of me wanted to rush down there and throw them out immediately. But the logical part of my brain, the part that built a logistics empire, reminded me that a smell is not proof. If I accused her now, she would claim it was mouthwash, or that Maria was lying. I needed something undeniable. I needed something that would hold up in court and in the court of public opinion. I opened the safe behind my desk and pulled out a small black box. Inside were 3 high-definition micro-cameras disguised as standard smoke detectors. "Can you get these into the cottage?" I asked Maria. "I will tell them you are obsessed with fire safety," she replied, taking the box. "They think you are a controlling old man anyway. They will not question it." An hour later, I watched the installation process from my laptop screen. Maria stood on a step stool in the cottage living room, drilling the mount into the ceiling. Vanessa was awake now, complaining loudly about the noise and the dust falling on her yoga mat. Brandon was sitting in the corner, staring blankly at his phone, ignoring everything. "You are making a mess," Maria Vanessa snapped. "Hurry up and get out. I need my rest." "I am almost done, Mrs. Vanessa," Maria said, her voice calm and subservient. "Mr. Douglas just wants to make sure you are safe." Maria snapped the plastic cover onto the detector. A tiny red light blinked once. It looked like a standard power indicator, but on my screen the image flared to life. The wide-angle lens captured the entire room in crisp 4K resolution. I could see the sweat on Brandon's forehead. I could see the water bottle on the table. And I could see the look of pure contempt on Vanessa's face as the door closed behind Maria. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the rat to take the cheese. Dưới đây là nội dung chi tiết cho đoạn 22, được viết bằng tiếng Anh. Theo phong cách tự sự của nhân vật Douglas, tập trung vào hành động và cảm xúc để phù hợp với dòng đọc AI. The technology Maria had installed was worth every penny. Sitting in the darkened sanctuary of my study, I watched the feed on my laptop screen with the intensity of a sniper waiting for a target. The image was crystal clear. I could see the dust motes dancing in the light of the cottage living room. I could see the tension in Brandon's shoulders as he sat on the edge of the cheap sofa. But most importantly, I could see Vanessa. She had just walked out of the bathroom toweling dry her hair. She was still wearing that oversized gray sweatshirt, the prop she used to sell the narrative of the destitute mother to the world. She walked over to the windows and peeked through the blinds, ensuring that no one from the main house was watching. Satisfied that the coast was clear, she turned back to the room and let out a long, exaggerated groan of annoyance. "I am sweating to death in this thing," she complained, her voice picked up clearly by the high-sensitivity microphone. What happened next was an image that will be burned into my retinas forever. An image that finally killed the last lingering hope that I might be a grandfather. Vanessa reached under the hem of her sweatshirt. She didn't caress a baby bump. She didn't speak softly to a growing life. Instead, she fumbled with a set of clips at her back. There was a sound of Velcro tearing that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. She pulled the sweatshirt up and unstrapped a large flesh-colored mound from her midsection. It was a prosthetic, a high-quality silicone belly likely purchased from a theatrical supply store or a specialized website. She pulled it off her body and tossed it onto the coffee table, where it landed with a hollow, rubbery thud. She stood there, completely flat stomach, visible in her tight tank top, stretching her back like an athlete after a workout. "God, I hate that thing," she sighed, scratching her side where the straps had dug in. "It itches like crazy." But did you see his face, Brandon? Did you see the look in the old man's eyes when I showed him the test? I watched my son. This was his moment. This was the moment for him to stand up and say this had gone too far. But Brandon just looked at the silicone belly on the table and then back at his phone. "He looked guilty," Vanessa Brandon muttered. "He looked like he wanted to cry." "Exactly." Vanessa laughed, walking over to the mini fridge to grab a soda. "Guilt is the currency we are trading in right now, honey. That old dinosaur is desperate for a legacy. He thinks I am carrying the golden heir, as long as he believes that we are untouchable. We just need to keep this up for a few more weeks until he signs over the trust fund for the baby. Then we can have a tragic miscarriage and fly to Paris with the cash. Brandon looked up, his face pale. You make it sound so easy. What if he asks for a doctor's appointment? What if he wants an ultrasound? Don't be such a coward, Vanessa snapped, popping the tab on her soda. I have already paid off a nurse at the clinic to fake the records. We are 10 steps ahead of him. The old fool actually thinks he is being benevolent letting us stay here. He has no idea he has just invited the fox into the henhouse. I sat back in my leather chair, my hand resting on the mouse. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger is a hot emotion. What I felt was absolute zero. I moved the cursor to the bottom of the screen and clicked the record button, ensuring the file was saved to 3 different encrypted cloud servers. She called me a dinosaur. She called me a fool. She thought she was the fox in the henhouse. She was wrong. I wasn't the hen. I was the farmer with a shotgun, and I had just caught the vermin red-handed. I closed the laptop lid slowly. The evidence was secured. The trap was not just sprung, it had snapped shut around their necks, and they didn't even feel the steel teeth yet. I saved the video file under 3 different names on 3 different encrypted drives. It was the digital smoking gun that would eventually end the war, but I wasn't ready to pull the trigger just yet. A lesser man would have stormed down to the guest cottage, kicked down the door, and ripped that silicone lie right off her body. But I am not a man who plays for a draw, I play for a checkmate. If I exposed them now, they would simply leave. They would disappear into the night, perhaps to run another scam on another unsuspecting victim. No, I needed to bury them so deep that they could never crawl back out. Besides, the camera feed had revealed something else, something that piqued my curiosity. At 2 a.m, when the estate was silent and the snow was falling softly, the motion sensor on the back porch of the cottage had triggered. I watched as Vanessa, dressed in dark clothes, slipped out the rear window, like a thief in the night. She didn't look like a pregnant woman in distress. She moved with the agility of a cat, scaling the low stone wall at the perimeter of the property and disappearing into the darkness of the service road. Where does a woman with no money, no car, and a fake pregnancy go at 3 a.m. in the middle of winter? I picked up the phone and dialed a number that didn't appear in my official contacts list. It belonged to Frank, a former homicide detective, who had found that the private sector paid better and asked fewer questions. Frank was the kind of man who could blend into a brick wall if he had to. He didn't have an office, he had a booth at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. I met him there an hour later. The diner smelled of grease and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of my life. Frank was nursing a black coffee, his eyes scanning the parking lot, even as I slid into the booth opposite him. You look like hell, Douglas. Frank grunted, not bothering with pleasantries. I feel like it, I admitted, sliding a thick manila envelope across the sticky table. But I am waking up. Inside that envelope is a photo of my daughter-in-law and the location of the guest cottage she is currently infesting. Frank peeked inside the envelope. Pretty girl, he muttered. Looks like trouble. You have no idea, I said. She is sneaking out of the estate between 2 and 4 in the morning. She climbs the back wall and heads toward the service road. Frank raised an eyebrow. No car. I repossessed it, I said, allowing myself a small, grim smile. She is on foot, which means someone is picking her up, or she is walking to meet someone nearby. And you want to know who? Frank said, tucking the envelope into his leather jacket. I want to know everything. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. I want to know where she goes. I want to know who she talks to. I want to know what she drinks and what she smokes. If she visits a storage unit, I want to know what is in it. If she meets a man, I want his name and his social security number. Frank nodded slowly. This isn't just a tail job, is it? You are building a coffin. I am preparing the nails, I corrected him. I need photos, Frank. High resolution. If she is doing what I think she is doing, she is likely meeting with an accomplice. Or maybe she is just spending the cash she stole from my son. Either way, I need the proof. Frank stood up, throwing a few crumpled bills on the table for his coffee. Consider it done, he said. If she moves a muscle tonight, I will be her shadow. Go home, Douglas. Get some sleep. You look like a man who is waiting for the executioner. I watched him walk out into the cold, gray afternoon. I didn't go home to sleep. I went back to my study to watch the monitors. I felt a strange vibration in my chest. It wasn't fear and it wasn't grief. It was the thrill of the hunt. Vanessa thought she was the predator sneaking out into the night to feed. She had no idea that she had just become the prey. The wait for the truth is always harder than the truth itself. I spent the next 24 hours pacing the floor of my study, watching the snow pile up against the window pane. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just watched the monitors and waited for my phone to ring. When Frank finally called, his voice was heavy with the kind of fatigue that comes from watching dirty people do dirty things in the dark. He didn't want to talk over the phone. He said he needed to show me. He arrived at the main house just after midnight, entering through the service door to avoid alerting the vultures in the guest cottage. He looked exhausted. He shook the snow off his coat and laid a thick manila envelope on my desk. He didn't sit down. He just looked at me with a strange expression. It was pity. I hate pity. You were right, Douglas, Frank said quietly. She is not walking alone, and she is not walking aimlessly. But you might want to pour yourself a drink before you open that. I ignored the advice. My hands were steady as I undid the clasp of the envelope. I slid the glossy 8x10 photographs onto the mahogany surface of my desk. The first photo showed Vanessa climbing over the back wall of the estate, just as I had seen on the monitor. She was agile-focused and dressed in black. The second photo showed her walking down the service road toward a waiting vehicle. It wasn't a taxi. It wasn't a rideshare. It was a sleek, long wheelbase Bentley parked in the shadows of the old oak trees. I knew that car. I knew that custom midnight blue paint job. I had seen it parked across from my building for 30 years. I flipped to the third photo, and the air left my lungs. The window of the Bentley was rolled down. The interior light was on, casting a warm yellow glow on the faces of the occupants. Vanessa was leaning into the car. She wasn't just talking to the driver. She was kissing him. It was a passionate, familiar kiss. The kind of kiss shared by lovers who are celebrating a victory. And the man pulling her close, the man with the silver hair and the shark-like smile, was not a stranger. It was Gavin Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Industries, my biggest competitor. The man who had spent the last 3 decades trying to bankrupt me. The man who had tried to execute a hostile takeover of King Logistics 5 years ago and failed. The room spun. The pieces of the puzzle didn't just fall into place, they slammed together with the force of a collision. This wasn't just a family dispute. This wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law trying to get a payout. This was corporate espionage. This was a calculated assassination of my legacy from the inside out. I looked at the next photo. Gavin was handing Vanessa a thick envelope. Cash. Payoff money. They had played us all. Gavin knew he couldn't beat me in the boardroom, so he sent a Trojan horse into my son's bed. He had planted Vanessa to seduce Brandon to marry him and to slowly rot the company from within. The horse tranquilizer, the public humiliation, the fake pregnancy, it was all orchestrated by Gavin Thorne to destroy the stock price so he could swoop in and buy my life's work for pennies on the dollar. And Brandon, my poor, stupid son. He wasn't just a villain in this story. He was the biggest victim of them all. He thought he was conspiring with his wife to take over the company. He had no idea that his wife was sleeping with the enemy, and that once I was out of the way, Gavin would crush him just as easily as he planned to crush me. I looked up at Frank. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Frank sighed. "I ran a background check on her alias. She was an executive assistant at Thorne Industries 4 years ago before she met Brandon. They have been playing the long game, Douglas." I picked up the photo of Gavin kissing the woman who claimed to be carrying my grandchild. The anger I felt was different this time. It wasn't hot. It was cold. It was absolute. "Thank you, Frank," I said, sliding the photos back into the envelope. "You can go now." "What are you going to do?" Frank asked, pausing at the door. I looked at the phone. I looked at the contact list where Gavin's number was stored under Do Not Answer. "I am going to host a dinner party," I said, "and I think it is time to invite the neighbors." The glow of the computer monitor was the only light in my study, casting long, spectral shadows across the room. I had moved past the stage of anger and entered a state of cold, clinical detachment. I was no longer a father watching his son or a CEO watching an employee. I was a surgeon examining a tumor, determining exactly where to make the cut to remove it without killing the patient. I had installed the monitoring software on Brandon's phone 3 years ago. At the time, I told myself it was for security protocols to protect company data from hackers. But deep down, I think I knew that a man as weak as my son would eventually become a liability. I never expected that the threat would come from the woman sleeping beside him. The alert flashed on my screen at 2:15 in the morning. An outgoing call from Brandon's device. The number was blocked, but my software bypassed the encryption instantly. It was a direct line to a burner phone registered to a shell corporation owned by Gavin Thorne. I put on my headphones and pressed the listen key. The audio quality was terrifyingly crisp. I could hear the rustle of sheets and the sound of running water in the background. Brandon was likely in the shower washing away the guilt of his existence. Vanessa had waited for that exact moment to pick up his phone. "He is terrified, Gavin." Vanessa's voice came through the line. She was whispering, but the greed in her tone was loud enough to shatter glass. "He thinks the old man is going to soften up. He thinks if we just play the humble family card for a few more days, Douglas will sign the reinstatement papers." I heard a low chuckle on the other end. It was Gavin. I recognized that laugh. It was the sound of a hyena circling a dying lion. "Forget about the reinstatement," Gavin said. "What about the access codes?" "I have them," Vanessa replied. "I watched him type them in yesterday. As soon as Douglas signs that power of attorney form giving Brandon temporary control due to his failing health, I am logging in." I leaned forward in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. The treason. "I am going to pull the entire client database." Vanessa continued, her voice trembling with excitement. "Not just the mailing list, Gavin. I mean everything. The pricing algorithms, the shipping routes for the government contracts, the direct contact numbers for the Amazon logistics team. I am going to download it all to an external drive. That is the Holy Grail," Gavin purred. "With that data, I can underbid King Logistics on every single major contract. I will bankrupt Douglas in 6 months, and then we buy the scraps," Vanessa added. "Exactly," Gavin said. "And what about Brandon?" Vanessa let out a sigh of pure dismissive contempt. "The idiot will do whatever I tell him. He thinks we are doing this to save his inheritance. Once we have the money and the company is gutted, I will file for divorce. He can keep the fake baby." The line went dead. I took off the headphones and set them down on the desk with trembling hands. It wasn't just a takeover. It was an execution. They were going to strip the flesh from the bones of my company and leave the carcass for the vultures. The client database was the heart of King Logistics. It contained 30 years of trust and negotiation. If Gavin got his hands on that, he wouldn't just beat me, he would erase me. And Brandon, my foolish, blinded son. He wasn't even a partner in the crime. He was just the key they were using to unlock the safe before they melted it down. I looked at the digital recording file on my screen. I clicked save. The investigation was over. I had the motive. I had the method. And I had the confession. I picked up my phone and dialed Leonard Pike. It was 3 a.m, but I knew he would answer. "Wake up, Leonard," I said, my voice steady and hard. "The ceasefire is over. It is time to drop the bomb." The transformation of the King estate began at dawn. I watched from my balcony as the fleet of trucks arrived, carrying enough white lilies and blue hydrangeas to bury a small town. I had given the event planner a blank check and a single instruction. I told her I wanted a spectacle. I told her I wanted a celebration fit for a royal coronation. She thought I was a doting grandfather trying to make up for lost time. She had no idea she was decorating a slaughterhouse. The theme was a new legacy. It was printed in gold foil on the cream-colored invitations that were hand-delivered to the elite of Chicago. I sat in the library signing the checks, my hand steady and my mind clear. Brandon and Vanessa were vibrating with excitement. They were running around the house, picking out linens and tasting appetizers, their earlier fear completely replaced by the arrogance of victory. They believed the lie. They believed that the pressure of the stock market and the public shaming had finally broken me. I called Brandon into the room just before noon. He looked nervous, adjusting his tie like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "I am tired, son," I said, letting my shoulders slump to mimic the defeat he wanted to see. "I am too old for this war. Tonight we bury the hatchet. I am going to announce the transfer of the CEO title to you, and I am going to set up the trust fund for the baby." Brandon's eyes lit up with a greed that was painful to watch. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't thank me. He just asked if the lawyers would have the papers ready to sign on stage. "They will be there," I promised him. "Everything will be signed and sealed in front of the witnesses." But the most important invitation was the one I handled myself. I didn't send a courier. I sent my head of security to the headquarters of Thorne Industries. The envelope was heavy, thick cardstock sealed with wax. Inside was a personal note from me to Gavin Thorne. "Dear Gavin," it read, "you have won. Come drink my champagne and watch me hand over the keys to the kingdom. I would hate for my oldest friend to miss the end of an era." It was the bait Gavin could not resist. His ego was his Achilles heel. He wouldn't miss the chance to see me humbled. He wouldn't miss the chance to stand in my home and gloat, while his secret mistress and my foolish son handed him my life's work. By 6 o'clock, the driveway was a river of headlights. The press was there in force, just as I had arranged. I wanted cameras. I wanted microphones. I wanted the entire city to see exactly what happened when you crossed Douglas King. Vanessa was in the master bedroom, squeezing her prosthetic belly into a $3,000 maternity gown I had paid for. She was laughing on the phone, probably telling her friends that the old dinosaur had finally rolled over. I put on my tuxedo. I adjusted my cufflinks. I looked in the mirror one last time. I didn't see a victim. I saw a man who had dug 3 graves and was ready to fill them. The music started downstairs, a string quartet playing something soft and unsuspecting. The glasses clinked. The laughter rose. I opened the door and walked out to the landing. Below me, the sharks were circling, holding flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. They looked up and smiled. Let the party begin. The grand ballroom of my estate had transformed into a theater of the absurd. I stood on the periphery holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the scene unfold, with the detached interest of a director watching a play he has already memorized. The room was awash in soft golden light, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers and the diamonds dripping from the necks of the socialites who had come to witness the spectacle. I had spared no expense. There were towers of imported seafood ice sculptures carved into the shape of baby blocks, and a string quartet playing waltzes that were sweet enough to rot your teeth. In the center of this swirling galaxy of wealth stood Vanessa. She was the sun around which everyone orbited. She was wearing the midnight blue maternity gown I had paid for a dress, designed to hug the curve of the silicone lie strapped to her stomach. She played her part to perfection. She rested one hand protectively on the prosthetic bump, while the other held a glass of non-alcoholic cider. She accepted the compliments of the board members' wives with a shy, blushing humility that made my stomach turn. "Oh, you are absolutely glowing," one of the shareholders' wives gushed, reaching out to touch the fake belly. "Motherhood suits you so well, my dear." Vanessa smiled that beatific practiced smile. "Thank you," she cooed. "We are just so blessed. We cannot wait to meet him." Brandon stood beside her, looking handsome in his tuxedo, but his eyes were glassy. He was drinking scotch, heavily masking his nerves with alcohol. He was shaking hands, accepting congratulations for a virility he didn't possess and a promotion he hadn't earned. He looked like a man who had won the lottery but lost his ticket. Then the energy in the room shifted. It was a subtle change, like the drop in pressure before a tornado touches down. Gavin Thorne had arrived. He walked through the double doors with the swagger of a man who believes he has already conquered the castle. He was wearing a velvet tuxedo jacket that screamed new money. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his shark-like smile was on full display. He didn't look like a guest. He looked like the new landlord coming to inspect the property. He made a beeline for the happy couple, bypassing the waiters and the minor dignitaries. I watched from the shadows as he approached them. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a handshake. He pulled Vanessa into a hug that lingered a fraction of a second too long for a casual acquaintance. "Congratulations to the growing family," Gavin said, his voice booming enough for the nearby guests to hear. "This is a momentous occasion." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small signature blue box from Tiffany. He handed it to Vanessa, not Brandon. "A little something for the little king," he said, winking. Vanessa opened the box. It was a silver baby rattle encrusted with diamonds. It was gaudy. It was excessive. It was exactly the kind of gift a man gives to his mistress when he is trying to mark his territory in front of her husband. "Oh, Gavin, you shouldn't have." Vanessa gasped, feigning shock. "It is beautiful." I watched their eyes meet over the open box. It was brief, but I caught it. The look of shared conspiracy. The look of two thieves counting their loot while the police are still outside. Gavin's eyes slid down to her fake stomach, and he smirked. He thought it was the funniest joke in the world. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. I took a sip of my water. "Enjoy your moment, Gavin," I thought. "Enjoy the champagne and the music and the thrill of your secret victory. Because in about 10 minutes, the music is going to stop. And when it does, you are going to wish you had never walked through those doors." The clinking of silverware against fine china died down as I walked up the 3 steps to the raised platform at the front of the ballroom. The spotlight hit me blindingly bright, creating a halo of white light that separated me from the darkness where the predators lurked. I tapped the microphone twice. The heavy thud echoed through the speakers, silencing the few remaining whispers in the back of the room. I looked out at the sea of faces. I saw the envy in the eyes of my competitors. I saw the hunger in the eyes of the press. And in the front row, bathed in the soft glow of the table candles, I saw my son and his wife holding hands, a portrait of deceit framed in tuxedo black and maternity blue. "Thank you all for coming." I began, my voice steady and warm, the voice of the benevolent patriarch they expected to hear. "Tonight is a night of revelation. Tonight, we turn the page on the past and look toward the future, a future that has been carefully crafted by the people sitting right here in the front row." I gestured toward Brandon and Vanessa. They beamed. Vanessa gave a little wave, playing the shy mother-to-be perfectly. Brandon raised his glass in a salute to me, thinking he was raising a toast to his inheritance. "We often talk about legacy," I continued, gripping the sides of the podium. "We talk about what we leave behind. Some leave money, some leave buildings. But the most important thing a family leaves behind is the truth. And tonight, I want to share the absolute truth with all of you. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote control. "My family has prepared a special presentation," I said, looking directly at Gavin Thorne, who was smirking near the bar. "A look at the moments that brought us here. Please turn your attention to the main screen." The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The massive LED wall behind me, which had been displaying a looped image of the King Logistics logo, flickered to black. The music stopped. The room held its breath, expecting a montage of baby photos, ultrasound scans, and sentimental music. Instead, a grainy handheld video flickered to life. The date stamp in the corner was from 3 days ago. The location was unmistakably the service pantry of my executive suite. The camera angle was low, peering through the crack of a slightly open door. It was Maria's view. She had filmed this while hiding, terrified and shaking, but brave enough to keep the lens focused. On the massive screen, 50 feet wide, Vanessa appeared. She was standing over the coffee machine. She wasn't glowing. She wasn't smiling. Her face was twisted in a mask of intense concentration. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as the Vanessa on the screen reached into her bra and pulled out a small, unmarked glass vial. She looked over her shoulder, checking the door, her eyes looking directly into the hidden camera lens without seeing it. She uncorked the vial. With steady, deliberate hands, she poured a thick, clear liquid into the blue ceramic mug. My mug. The mug I had used for 20 years. She didn't just pour it. She stirred it. She held it up to the light to make sure it had dissolved. Then a chilling smile spread across her face on the screen. It was a smile of pure malice. "One scoop for the old man," she whispered in the video, the audio amplified by the ballroom's $1 million sound system. "Sleep tight, Douglas." The screen froze on that image. Vanessa holding the poisoned cup, smiling like a demon. For 3 seconds there was absolute silence. It was a vacuum, a void where the air had been sucked out of the room. Then the sound of shattering glass broke the spell. Vanessa had dropped her sparkling cider. It hit the marble floor and exploded, splashing sticky liquid onto the hem of her expensive gown. She stood up, her face draining of all color, her mouth opening and closing in a silent scream. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. It started as a low rumble of confusion and rose into a crescendo of shock. People stood up, knocking over chairs. The reporters in the back were frantically typing, their flashes going off like strobe lights. "That is a lie," Vanessa shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "That is deepfake. That is AI. He made it up." I leaned into the microphone, my voice booming over the chaos. "I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, the only thing fake in this room is the woman standing in the front row." I didn't give them time to breathe. The shock of the poison video was still rippling through the room like a physical wave, but I pressed the button on the remote again. The screen flickered and the image changed. The silence in the ballroom shifted from horrified to confused as the scene shifted to the interior of the guest cottage. The timestamp was from yesterday afternoon. On the massive screen, Vanessa stood in the center of the living room. She looked annoyed. She was scratching at her midsection. The microphone picked up the sound of Velcro ripping. It was a harsh, tearing sound that echoed through the silent ballroom. With a look of pure relief, the Vanessa on the screen pulled up her sweatshirt and unstrapped the large, flesh-colored silicone mound from her body. She tossed it onto the coffee table, where it landed with a hollow, rubbery thud that seemed to vibrate in the hearts of everyone watching. "There goes the baby," someone whispered in the front row. The spell of the glowing mother was broken. The heir to the king fortune was nothing but a prop bought from a costume store. But I wasn't done. I had one final nail for the coffin. One final lesson for my son. The video cut to black and white night vision. It was grainy, but the faces were unmistakable. It showed a luxury car parked on the service road. The window rolled down, revealing the profile of Gavin Thorne. Vanessa leaned into the car window. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a predator claiming her prize. She kissed him. It was deep and passionate, and it went on for a long, uncomfortable time. Then the audio cut in. It was clear as a bell. "When are we going to dump the dead weight?" Gavin asked on the recording. As soon as the check's clear, Vanessa's voice replied, laughing. "Brandon is such a useful idiot. He actually thinks I love him. He is pathetic, Gavin. He is a weak little boy who needs his daddy's money. Once we strip the company, I am leaving him in the gutter where he belongs." The video ended. The screen went black. The lights in the ballroom did not come back on. The darkness felt heavy, suffocating. I looked down at the front row. Brandon was standing there, but he wasn't really there anymore. His soul had left his body. His face was the color of old ash. He looked at the black screen where his wife had just confessed to using him. Then he looked at Vanessa. She was backing away from him, her hands up in a defensive posture, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. Then Brandon looked at Gavin Thorne. Gavin was frozen, his shark-like smile replaced by the terror of a man who knows his career is over. Brandon didn't scream. He didn't yell. The glass of scotch he had been holding slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor and shattered. The sound was small and insignificant compared to the sound of his life breaking apart. But in the silent room, it sounded like a gunshot. He turned to look at me. His eyes were wide and wet. For the first time in years, I didn't see the arrogant executive or the greedy son. I saw the 10-year-old boy who had fallen off his bike and was looking for his father to pick him up. But I couldn't pick him up this time. I had to let him fall so he could finally learn how to stand. I stepped back to the microphone. "I believe the presentation speaks for itself," I said quietly. "Security, please escort the trespassers off my property." And Brandon. My son looked up at me, broken and weeping. "I suggest you get a very good divorce lawyer," I added, "because you are going to need one." The explosion I had been waiting for finally detonated. The silence that followed the video didn't last. It was broken by a sound that wasn't human. It was a guttural, animalistic roar that tore from Brandon's throat. The shock that had paralyzed him evaporated in a split second, replaced by a blinding white-hot rage. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask for an explanation. He just launched himself across the few feet of marble floor that separated him from the man who had stolen his dignity. Gavin Thorne saw it coming. The shark-like smile finally dropped from his face, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a man realizing he is trapped in a room with a wild beast. He tried to step back. He tried to raise his hands to defend himself, but he was too slow and too soft. Brandon collided with him with the force of a freight train. They went down in a tangle of expensive fabric and flailing limbs, crashing into a table filled with crystal champagne flutes. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood echoed through the ballroom. The crowd screamed and surged backward, creating a circle around the violence. This wasn't a gentleman's duel. It was a street brawl in tuxedos. Brandon was on top of him, pinning Gavin to the floor amidst the broken glass and spilled alcohol. He was punching blindly, striking Gavin's face, his chest, his throat. Every blow was a release of years of insecurity. Every strike was a rejection of the betrayal. "Get off me!" Gavin shrieked, trying to shield his face, his voice cracking with fear. "You are crazy! Get him off me!" But nobody moved. The security guards stood at the perimeter, their arms crossed, watching with stoic indifference. I had given them strict orders. Let them fight. Let them tear each other apart. This was part of the lesson. While the two men rolled on the floor, destroying their reputations and their tailored suits, Vanessa saw her opening. She realized that the attention of the room was focused on the blood being spilled on the carpet. She didn't scream for her husband. She didn't try to stop the fight. She did exactly what a survivor does. She ran. She hiked up the heavy skirt of her midnight blue gown, kicking off her high heels so she could run faster. She abandoned the pretense of the pregnancy, clutching the prosthetic belly like a football as she sprinted toward the side exit, the one that led to the garden and the freedom of the dark. Her eyes were wild, darting left and right, looking for an escape route from the hell she had created. She reached the double doors, her hand outstretched for the brass handle. She probably thought she could make it to the main road. She probably thought she could flag down a car and disappear into the night before the police arrived. But the doors didn't open. Instead, a shadow stepped in front of her, blocking out the light. It was Mike. My head of security. The man she had insulted in the lobby. The man she had threatened to fire. He stood there like a mountain of granite, his face impassive. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing his tactical gear, and he looked ready for a riot. "Move!" Vanessa screamed, breathless and frantic. "Get out of my way, you peasant! I am leaving!" Mike didn't budge. He looked down at her, at the smeared makeup and the fake belly that had slipped sideways during her sprint. "I am afraid I cannot do that, Mrs. King." Mike said, his voice calm and deep. "The police are on their way. And Mr. Douglas gave specific instructions. Nobody leaves the party until the check is paid." Vanessa spun around, looking for another way out, but there was none. She was trapped. She backed up against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor, burying her face in her hands. I stood on the podium watching the chaos below, the fighting, the screaming, the crying. It was a masterpiece of destruction. I took a sip of my water. The taste was clean and cold. The house was a wreck, but for the first time in years, the air felt clear. The storm had finally broken. The wail of the sirens outside wasn't a warning. It was a symphony. The blue and red strobe lights from the patrol cars washed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the elegant ballroom into a chaotic disco of law enforcement. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance swung open with a force that commanded attention. It wasn't the caterers this time. It was Chief Miller, a man I had known since we were both rookies in our respective fields. He walked into the room with the heavy, confident stride of a man who has the law on his hip. Behind him flowed a stream of uniformed officers, their faces grim, their hands resting on their belts. The music stopped. The whispers stopped. Even the sobbing from the corner where Vanessa huddled ceased abruptly. Chief Miller didn't look at the guests. He didn't look at the spilled champagne or the shattered glass. He looked directly at me up on the podium and gave a single, barely perceptible nod. I nodded back. The signal was given. "Officers, secure the room," Miller barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. 2 officers marched straight toward Mike, who stepped aside to reveal the cowering form of my daughter-in-law. Vanessa looked up, mascara running down her face in black rivets. She tried to pull the pregnant victim card one last time, clutching her stomach and whimpering. "Please help me," she cried. "My husband went crazy. I need a doctor for the baby." The female officer didn't blink. She reached down and grabbed Vanessa's arm, hauling her to her feet with zero sympathy. "Vanessa King, you are under arrest." The officer recited the Miranda rights flowing automatically. "You are charged with attempted grievous bodily harm with a toxic substance and conspiracy to commit fraud. We have the video evidence of the poisoning and the toxicology report from the victim." "Turn around!" Vanessa screamed as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The movement caused the strap of her prosthetic belly to snap. The silicone mound slid out from under her dress and fell to the floor with a hollow thud right at the feet of the chief of police. He looked down at it, then back at her with pure disgust. "Add resisting arrest to the list," Miller said. "Get her out of here." As they dragged Vanessa away, screaming about lawyers and lawsuits, Miller turned his attention to the pile of broken furniture where Gavin Thorne was trying to stand up. Gavin wiped the blood from his split lip, trying to regain some shred of dignity. He straightened his torn velvet jacket and glared at the chief. This was a mutual combat situation, Gavin spat, his voice slurring through his swollen jaw. I am the victim here. That maniac attacked me. I want to press charges for assault. Chief Miller laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. We aren't here for the fistfight, Mr. Thorne. That is a civil matter. I am here for the federal warrant. Gavin froze. Federal. You are under arrest for corporate espionage and multiple counts of insider trading, Miller announced loud enough for every business rival in the room to hear. The stock purchase you made yesterday based on stolen data was flagged by the SEC this morning. It seems you bought heavily into a shell company that Mr. King set up specifically to catch a leak. I watched the color drain from Gavin's face. The realization hit him harder than Brandon's fist ever could. The data Vanessa had stolen. The secret files. It was all a plant. I had fed them fake information, and Gavin had swallowed the bait hook, line, and sinker. He hadn't just bought stocks. He had bought a one-way ticket to federal prison. I didn't do it. Gavin stammered, backing away. It was her. It was the girl. She tricked me. Tell it to the judge, Miller said, signaling his men. They grabbed Gavin by the arms. The man who wanted to be the king of Chicago was marched out in handcuffs, his head hanging low, his legacy destroyed in a single night. I watched them go. The house was a mess. My family was in ruins. But as the police cars drove away, taking the poison out of my life, I felt lighter than I had in 20 years. The cancer was cut out. Now the healing could begin. The last blue light of the police cruisers faded against the ballroom walls, leaving us in a silence that was louder than the sirens. The party was over. The guests were filing out quickly, their heads down, afraid to make eye contact with the wreckage of the King dynasty. The floor was sticky with spilled champagne and littered with broken glass, the physical remnants of a celebration that had turned into a funeral for a marriage. Brandon stood in the center of the debris. His tuxedo was torn at the shoulder, his lip was bleeding, and his hands were shaking violently. He looked at the door where they had dragged his wife away, and then he turned slowly to look at me. I was still standing on the podium, the captain of a ship who had steered through the storm while his crew mutinied. He walked toward me. His steps were heavy, uncoordinated. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he didn't try to climb up to my level. Instead, his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the cold marble right at my feet. It was a pathetic sight. My son, the heir I had raised to be a titan of industry, kneeling in the broken glass like a beggar. Dad. He choked out, his voice thick with tears and blood. Please, you have to understand. I didn't know about the poison. I swear on Mom's grave I didn't know she was hurting you. I was just trying to prove myself. I wanted you to be proud of me. I wanted to save the company. She told me this was the only way. Please, Dad, give me a chance to fix this. He reached out his hand, trying to grasp the hem of my trousers. His fingers were stained with the blood from the fight. I looked down at him. I tried to find a spark of pity in my heart. I tried to remember the little boy I used to take fishing, the boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee. But that boy was gone. In his place was a stranger, a weak man who had let a wolf into our home because she flattered his ego. I stepped back, moving out of his reach. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The disappointment was heavy enough to crush him. Ignorance is not a defense, Brandon, I said, my voice echoing in the empty hall. You say you didn't know. That is worse. You lived with her, you slept beside her, you let her manipulate you into betraying your own father, and you were too blind to see the knife in her hand. But I love her, Brandon sobbed, burying his face in his hands. I thought she loved me. Love, I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. You don't know the meaning of the word. Love is protection. Love is loyalty. What you had was vanity. She played you like a cheap violin, Brandon, and you thanked her for the music while the ship went down. I looked around the room at the banners that said "A New Legacy." They mocked us now. "Get up," I ordered. Brandon looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. He thought I was going to offer him a hand. He thought I was going to forgive him, because that is what fathers do in the movies. But this wasn't a movie. This was business. "You asked for a chance to fix this," I said, cold as the winter wind outside. "There is nothing to fix. You are fired, Brandon. Not just from the company. You are fired from this family." He gasped as if I had struck him physically. "Dad, you can't mean that. A man who cannot protect his family is useless," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "But a man who opens the door for the enemy and feeds them his father's hand is a traitor. You stood on this stage and smiled while she plotted my death. You are weak, Brandon, and the one thing the name King cannot survive is weakness. You do not deserve this name." I turned my back on him. I heard him call out to me, a desperate, broken sound, but I didn't stop. I walked down the steps past the shattered crystal and the ruined flowers and headed toward my office. I had a company to rebuild, and I had to do it alone. Spring finally came to Chicago, melting the dirty ice that had covered the city during the darkest winter of my life. But the air inside the federal courthouse remained cold and sterile. I sat in the back row of Gallery 3, my hands resting on the head of my cane, watching the final act of this tragedy play out. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to witness the end of an era. The courtroom was packed with reporters who had been feeding on the scraps of the King family scandal for months. But when the bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, a hush fell over the room that was heavy with anticipation. Vanessa was brought in first. She was no longer the queen of the penthouse. The designer gowns and the diamond earrings were gone, replaced by a shapeless orange jumpsuit that washed out her complexion. Her hair, usually a golden helmet of perfection, was dark at the roots and pulled back into a messy bun. She looked small. She looked ordinary. When the judge read the verdict, she didn't scream or cry. She just stared at the table. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder, fraud, grand larceny. The judge called her a predator who had preyed on the elderly and the vulnerable. He sentenced her to 15 years in a maximum security facility without the possibility of parole for the first 10. As they led her away, she looked back at the gallery. She wasn't looking for Brandon. She was looking for me. Our eyes met for a second, and I gave her a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a final goodbye. Gavin Thorne followed shortly after. His fall was perhaps even more spectacular. The insider trading trap I had set with the fake client data had worked perfectly. The SEC had torn his finances apart like a pack of wolves. Thorne Industries was bankrupt, its assets liquidated and sold off to the highest bidder. I had purchased his headquarters building that morning for pennies on the dollar, just for the irony of it. Gavin received 10 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay restitution that would leave him destitute for the rest of his life. The shark had been defanged. But the sentence that weighed heaviest on my heart wasn't handed down by a judge in a black robe. It was the one I had imposed myself. Later that afternoon, I had my driver take me down to the industrial shipping yards on the south side of the city. We parked the car in the shadow of a massive crane, watching the shift change. The air smelled of diesel fuel and salt water. There he was. Brandon was wearing a neon yellow safety vest and steel-toed boots that looked too big for him. He wasn't sitting in a corner office signing papers. He was hauling crates of frozen fish from a cargo container onto a waiting truck. His face was smeared with grease and sweat. His hands, the hands that had never lifted anything heavier than a golf club, were raw and blistered. I watched him struggle with a heavy box, his legs shaking under the weight. He stumbled, but he didn't drop it. He gritted his teeth, adjusted his grip, and kept moving. He was working double shifts trying to pay off the legal fees and the debts Vanessa had racked up in his name. I had stripped him of his inheritance. I had taken his car, his house, and his title. He was living in a studio apartment the size of my closet and eating ramen noodles. My driver looked at me in the rearview mirror. "Do you want to say hello, sir?" he asked softly. I watched Brandon wipe his forehead with a dirty sleeve. For the first time in his life, he was earning his sleep. He was learning the value of $1 the hard way. "No," I said, rolling up the window. "Drive on. He has a lot of work to do." And so do I. The silence in the King estate was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. It was the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary that had been scrubbed clean of the parasites that once infested it. For the first time in years, I could drink my morning coffee without looking over my shoulder, and I could sleep without locking my bedroom door. But a house this size needs more than just one old man to keep it alive. It needs a heart, and for the last few months, that heart had been Maria. I called her into my study on a Tuesday morning. She entered wearing her usual uniform, carrying a duster, her head bowed in that respectful way she always had. She probably thought I was going to reprimand her for a streak on the window or a wrinkle in the sheets. "Put the duster down, Maria," I said, pointing to the leather chair opposite my desk. "Sit down." She sat on the edge of the seat, looking nervous. "Is everything all right, Mr. Douglas?" "Everything is finally perfect," I replied. I slid a thick document across the mahogany desk toward her. "This is a contract," I explained. "It states that effective immediately, you are no longer the housekeeper. You are the estate manager. You will hire the staff. You will manage the accounts for the property, and you will answer to no one but me." Maria's eyes went wide. She looked at the salary figure on the paper and gasped, covering her mouth. "Mr. Douglas, this is too much. I cannot accept this." "You saved my life, Maria," I said, my voice soft. "You saw the poison when my own son chose to be blind. You gave me the truth when everyone else was feeding me lies. Loyalty is the most expensive currency in the world, and you are a very rich woman." I watched tears well up in her eyes as she signed the paper. She wasn't just a servant anymore. She was the guardian of the gate. But there was still one empty space in my life: the legacy, the future. I had removed Brandon from the will, but I refused to let the King name die with me. I didn't want a biological accident to determine the future of my company. I wanted to choose my heir, the way I chose my investments, with care and precision. I established the Martha King Foundation in honor of my late wife. It was designed to find children from the broken parts of the city, children who had nothing but intelligence and a fire in their bellies. I spent weeks visiting orphanages and community centers looking for a spark. I found him in a dilapidated youth center on the west side. His name was Leo. He was 12 years old, sitting alone at a table trying to fix a broken radio with a rusty screwdriver. He was focused, intense, and completely ignoring the chaos around him. He reminded me of myself at that age. I sat down across from him. "Can you fix it?" I asked. He didn't look up. "It is not broken," he said. "The circuit is just interrupted. I am rerouting the power." I smiled. A problem solver. I didn't adopt him in the traditional sense of becoming a father. I became a mentor. I became the grandfather he never had. I paid for his education. I moved him into a top boarding school. Every Sunday, he comes to the estate not to play catch, but to learn about logistics, about supply chains, about how to run the world. Yesterday, as I watched Leo and Maria laughing in the garden, I realized the final truth of my life. I used to think family was about DNA. I thought it was about whose blood ran in your veins. I was wrong. Blood is just biology. True family are the people who stand by you when the house is on fire. True family are the people who protect you when you are weak and challenge you when you are wrong. Brandon was my blood, but he was a stranger. Maria and Leo were strangers, but they became my family. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot. It was safe. And for the first time in a long time, the future looked bright. The king legacy would survive not by birthright, but by merit. And that is the only legacy worth leaving. This story teaches us a powerful lesson about the true definition of family and legacy. We often assume that blood is thicker than water, but Douglas King learned that loyalty is the only bond that truly matters. While Brandon and Vanessa were consumed by their greed and entitlement, they lost the very privilege they felt they deserved because they chose shortcuts over integrity. In contrast, Maria and Leo proved that trust is built through actions, not promises. It reminds us to value those who protect us in our darkest moments, rather than those who only show up for the celebration. Ultimately, true legacy is not about the DNA you leave behind, but the values you instill in those who earn your respect. If you enjoyed this dramatic saga of justice and redemption, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the hidden world of the ultra-wealthy.